Gerald crouched low as he prepared to make a break for it. He watched the two forms as they stumbled about the 3-bedroom trailer, their movements angry and jerky. They were drunk again. They were drunk every night, and Gerald could see that if they caught him, there were several scenarios that would cause this to be his last escape attempt. He saw 4 potential paths before him, but only 2 were routes that wouldn't lead to his death. The 2 paths were black strings, paths that would lead to a bottle upside his head or an accidental shooting. The 3rd was a red string, danger, but a chance for escape. The 4th was a blue string, the familiar blue string that led to his future. Gerald tensed as he crouched between 2 bushes in his side yard, the backpack held tight against him as he watched that blue string. It was going over the side yard fence, out towards the road, and if he could get out of the yard and on the path, he'd be home free. He'd thought as much before, but he had a good feeling about tonight, and he thought this might be the successful run that got him out of his abusive little family situation. He had taken his first step, his trainers peeking from the bush, when he stopped dead in his tracks. The blue string was suddenly twinged with orange, and as he watched, the orange became red as the fibers filled in the blue. Crap. That meant danger. The back door was flung open suddenly, and his father stumbled out of their trailer and looked at the yard from the back porch. "Gerald! Where the hell are you, boy? I know you're out here, Gerald. You better get your ass back over here right now." Gerald was still as a statue. Had they checked his bed already? They couldn't have found the trap door that he made in the corner of the closet, or they'd be a lot madder than they already were. Clearly his dummy hadn't fooled them, and now he had been discovered. They didn't know where he was, but they suspected that he was close, and they meant to find him before he could escape. He looked back at the blue string, and sure enough, it had gone from blue to red, and was now slowly becoming black to match the other 3. If he went forward with this plan, he would surely die. The only way open to him was back the way he had come, the cord still a pulsating red, back into danger. But danger beat death every time. His dad was going back inside, and Gerald had made his move as the door closed. The trailer skirting came up easily, the victim of so many other botched escape attempts, and he was under the trailer and heading for his room with practiced ease. He peeked through the hole that he had made, the rug he had laid over it bulging as he checked his room, and found it to be empty. He left his backpack under the house and came up into his bedroom just as he heard his dad's heavy footsteps in the hallway. Gerald gritted his teeth. The old man was faster than he expected, and as Gerald made his slow way towards the bed, he was certain that his father would throw the door open and freeze him like a bug in the hallway light. He was nearly there, 3 easy steps, when he heard the clatter of the knob as his dad's meaty paw gripped it roughly. "Better be in that bed, you little shit!" Gerald tensed, seeing the black string that was forming between himself and the door, and knowing this beating would be his last. "Leave him alone, you brute," came a slurry voice from the living room. "He's probably just asleep. Let him sleep before you wake up the whole damn trailer park yelling like that." The doorknob stilled, and Gerald didn't look the gift horse in the mouth. He'd slid beneath the covers as his father's angry steps went up the hall, yelling at his mother to shut the hell up, and how he would discipline his boy any way he saw fit, and how... But Gerald shut his eyes as he shut out the yelling and shrieking, the sound of flesh on flesh as his dad slapped her or beat her or any number of other things. Gerald closed his eyes and scrunched down beneath the covers, praying it would all just end and he could fall into the mattress and be nothing but an afterthought. His dad didn't come back that night, and Gerald drifted off to the thought that at least he could try again tomorrow. The joy that thought brought him was not something that should bring solace to a 10-year-old, but Gerald wasn't a normal boy, after all. Gerald could see the strings, and the strings helped him stay one step ahead of his dad, his mom, and anyone else who might want to hurt him. Gerald had been able to see the strings for as long as he could remember. They were different colors, and he figured out pretty quick what they meant. Red was danger, orange was caution, yellow meant someone would likely be his friend, pink meant someone loved him, green meant he was being led towards money or other things, black meant certain death, and he had only just realized it in time the first time. Then there was blue. Blue was like the guiding marks in video games. Blue led him towards his destiny. At least, that's what he believed. Whenever a blue string led him to a person, they were always an important part of his life. It had led him to Kevin, his best friend. It had led him to Mr. Turner, the teacher who had gotten him through the 2nd grade and had helped him right up until his dad took him out of school. It led him to Lou, the janitor who had protected him from Hank, his bully. It had led him to Mrs. Castleberry, the teacher who had tried to help him escape his abusive father, right up until they had removed him from school. The blue string helped him grow closer to his goal, and Gerald was curious where it would lead him next. Away from this crumbling meth trailer, he hoped. It hadn't always been this bad, of course. When his dad had been working at the disposal plant, he'd been a nice, normal guy. He worked from 6 till 2 every day, had weekends off, and he'd been using a little bit of the meth to keep up with the younger guys at work. He had it under control, and his drinking wasn't so bad. He got a little drunk sometimes, but Gerald remembered his dad as a happy drunk who was the life of the party at cookouts and family gatherings. His mom had always been the rock at home, keeping everything together so that Gerald had a nice, soft place to land when he came home from school. They were living in a rental trailer owned by a guy who sold his dad drugs. That was true, but they were saving up for a house outside the trailer court, and soon, his dad had promised, they would have a nice new house with a big backyard and some things to play on and maybe even a puppy. Those days made Gerald smile when he remembered them, until he remembered that they had been a lie. Well, not a lie. Not really. More like a dream that remained unrealized, and likely would never be. It all started when his dad got hurt at work. "Please, Milton, I'm sorry." His mother's cries of pain woke him up, and Gerald realized he had only dozed off for a few minutes. He could hear the sound of his father's hand as he took his poor wife to task, slapping her again and again as she cried out pitifully. He was slurring something at her, his speech unintelligible between the drugs and the booze. She was gibbering wetly, and Gerald thought that he might be about to kill her like he intended to kill Gerald. "There, now look what you made me do. You think I like hitting you? Do you? Do you?" Whether he did or not, he hit her again for good measure, and then all was quiet beyond the low sobbing of his mother. She'd been part of the reason he hadn't left yet. Part, but not all. There was a naive part of Gerald that hoped that maybe things could turn around. Maybe they could be that happy family again. Maybe things could go back to what they were, and they could leave this depressing little place and return to the daydream of their brick house with the backyard and the puppy. It was a good dream, but it was never going to happen. It had all started with a bad fall. It had been raining when Dad fell. The rain had made the step where he put his foot slippery. The truck he had been riding on the back of had taken a bump a little too hard. His dad had been tired from lugging cans in the rain all day, and his grip hadn't been as good as it could be. Regardless of the reason, his father had slipped off the back of the truck and hurt his back. It hadn't been a bad injury. His father had healed up in a matter of weeks. The problem was that they had drug tested him, and when they found drugs in his system, they fired him. They assumed the drugs were the reason that he had fallen off the truck. They assumed that he had been wired on meth and gotten hurt. They assumed he wasn't being careful, and they let him go. They made a lot of assumptions, but all of them led to his dad being fired. That had led to his landlord making him an offer. When he couldn't pay the rent, his landlord offered to let him sell drugs in the trailer park. After he'd healed from his injury, he offered to teach him how to cook. His father cooked the product that he sold for his landlord, and by the time Gerald entered the 4th grade, his dad was hooked on a variety of substances. These drugs mixed well with his alcohol abuse, which was less of a fun party trick and more of a problem at home now. His mother was drinking as well, needing to cope with the prospects of living with Gerald's dad, and Gerald felt like he was the only sane person at home sometimes. 4th grade was the only year his dad started really hurting him. His dad had hurt him before. The more drugs he used and alcohol he drank, the angrier he seemed to become, but he was always careful about how he did it up until that point. Gone was the happy guy who used to toss the ball around with him or play Mario Kart on the old Super Nintendo in the living room. Gerald's dad was prone to fits of rage and sudden bouts of unexplainable anger, and it was usually targeted at Gerald or his mom. His mother tried to shield him from it more than once, but Gerald often found himself wearing long sleeves well into the hot months and pants year-round. So far, no one had seen the bruises or the burn marks or the casual clues of childhood trauma, but that would change one afternoon as he came home a little later than usual. It wasn't Gerald's fault he had been late. The bus had been running behind schedule, and Gerald had gotten home at 3:50 instead of 3:30. His dad had been waiting for him in the living room, and Gerald knew from the moment he saw him that he had been mad. He was sitting in his easy chair, his bloodshot eyes trained on the door, and when he called Gerald to him, his fingers had been digging furrows in the leather. "Where have you been?" his father growled, and Gerald could smell his rancid breath on his face. "The bus was late, Dad. The next thing he knew, he was lying on the floor, and his face felt like someone had hit it with a bat. "Don't you lie to me. I know you were out getting up to no good. Don't you dare lie to me. Don't you ever lie to me, boy. I'll—" But then his mother had come running in, screaming bloody murder, as she saw what he had done. "Milton, for God's sake, you punched him in the face!" That explained a lot to Gerald at that moment. As his mother cradled his head, his father looking angry and worried as he glowered over him, Gerald felt like one of those computers that's been trying to load something, but just can't find it. In this case, the something was his ability to breathe and speak. He was struggling to figure out what had happened to him, and thankfully, his mom was content to repeat it a half a dozen times so his brain could catch up. His dad had socked him one. He had punched his ticket. He had clocked him and bent his gears. Gerald felt his world spinning drunkenly, and when he'd passed out, it had been a mercy. As he lay here now, listening to his mother sniffle from the living room and the TV blare out a western or a war movie, Gerald wished for oblivion now too. He wished, but apparently whatever force grants wishes for little kids in desperate situations had the night off, and he was left to shudder in his fear and cowardice a while longer. Sometimes I think Ridley really has lost his mind. Agent Tanner was cruising through the trailer park, his lights off and his speed low. This was not the place you wanted to cruise this time of night, and he knew it. Anyone looking out the windows at 3 a.m. would assume that he was looking for some place to buy drugs, and who could blame them? He was rolling along in a Chomo Special, a white panel van with no windows in the back, and the whole thing just screamed kidnap job. He would have rather posted up outside the court, pretending to be broken down, but Ridley had been very clear on what he wanted them to do. You'll know the kid when you find him, or more likely he'll find you. I have a sneaking suspicion that the kid we're looking for will be just as ready to leave his situation as you will be to help him." "Shh," Danver hissed, looking fretfully. "He'll hear you." Tanner scoffed. "His ears are pretty big, but I don't think he can hear me 7 states away. And so what if he does? It's no secret we all think he's a nut." I don't," Agent Merrill Danvers said quickly. "I think he's a genius, and we should all thank him for the hard work that he does." Tanner rolled his eyes as he took a curve at 5 miles an hour and passed down another long line of identical trailers. A snatch of song occurred to him, something his mother had sung when he was very young, in a place as different as this from night and day. He didn't remember much about that time, a time before being taken to the kindergarten, but the things he remembered often came back in short bursts when he least expected them. Case in point, he remembered vividly the whir of his little dump truck on the thick carpet of his house, and the click, click, click of his mother's sewing needles as she sang a song that encapsulated this place so well. "Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same. There's a blue one, and a green one, and a pink one, and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they—" "Did you say something?" Agent Danvers said, and Tanner shook himself as he made another left turn. "Nothing," he whispered, looking at the houses as he rolled past, all of them looking much the same. "So, how do we know when we've found the right spot?" Danvers shrugged. "We don't, I guess. Just keep driving till we find him. We know he's here somewhere, so we just—" As the big double-wide came into view near the rear of the trailer court, Agent Tanner suddenly had a very new intuition that had nothing to do with the houses or ticky-tacky or anything. "I think, Danny boy, I might have a better idea." Gerald lay beneath the covers and listened to the snores coming from the living room. He couldn't be sure if it was a trap or not, but his mother had stopped crying, and that was a blessing. He looked at the floor of his bedroom and tried to find the string, seeing a pulsating orange line that extended into the hallway. Orange wasn't red. Orange was only slightly dangerous. But the pulsating made him think that time wasn't quite right yet. He yawned, not sure what time it was, but knowing it was early. He had dozed off for a little. He couldn't be sure how long. The old and battered Mickey Mouse alarm clock on the nightstand told him that it was about 3 a.m., but he wasn't entirely sure what time he had come back in through the hole in the floor. He rubbed a fist against his eyes, wincing as the pain moved through him. The first bruise was gone, but it hadn't been the last. The first one had been noticed by his teacher, Mrs. Castleberry. He had tried to hide it, not wanting his mother and father to get in trouble, but a black eye was harder to hide than bruises on your arms and legs. All his teachers knew that Gerald was not prone to fights and generally got along with his classmates. He had a way about him that often kept him away from bullies and gravitated him towards people who would be his friends. They also knew that Gerald's father had become mean as of late, refusing to help with class activities and generally being hostile to anyone who called the house to remind him of functions or parent-teacher nights. Many of them had suspected that his father had been abusing him for a few years now, and the size of that shiner that he now bore made them believe that he had finally taken it too far. When Mrs. Castleberry had asked him to stay after class, he'd been afraid that he'd done poorly on the last geography test he'd taken. It turned out it was much worse than that. "Gerald," she said, trying to be diplomatic, "I couldn't help but notice your injury. Are you feeling okay?" "Oh, this?" Gerald said, trying to laugh it off. It's nothing. I fell down the porch steps," he said, grasping for something that would sound believable. Mrs. Castleberry gave him a "we both know better than that" look, but proceeded on. "Oh my, well, I hope your parents took you to the hospital afterwards. Head wounds like that can have underlying effects on you as well." "Yes, ma'am," Gerald hedged. "Only they weren't home when I fell. I showed them when they got home, and since I wasn't feverish or dizzy, they said it was probably okay. Mom checked in on me throughout the night, and I guess I was just fine." "That's good," she said, though Gerald didn't think she really believed him. "Gerald, I think a great deal of you. A lot of your teachers think a lot of you, too. You're a joy to teach and a bright young man. Being as bright as you are, I know you know the difference between the truth and a lie." "Of course, Mrs. Castleberry," Gerald said, but I haven't lied to you. I really did. Gerald, I can see the knuckle ridges under your left eyebrow. You can be honest with me. If your father is hurting you, then it needs to stop." Gerald had begun to feed her the same line a second time, but that's when he saw the string. Right around her stomach, looking for all the world like a weird intestine as it flowed from her, was a blue string. Gerald had learned to trust the strings more than he trusted people. He'd seen one attached to Kevin when he first met him, and knew they were meant to be best friends. He had seen one attached to Mr. Turner, and even though he hadn't known him, he would have surely failed the second grade if he hadn't trusted him. It wasn't that Gerald was dumb, not by any stretch, but he was distractible. The strings often kept him distracted, watching as they zoomed off in every direction, but Mr. Turner had helped him with that. "I had a similar problem when I was your age," he confided, though Gerald hadn't told him about the strings. "Everything was more interesting than school, and I had to find a way to clear my mind. When you feel like that, just close your eyes and breathe in deep, then push everything out and find your peace." That had helped, and Mr. Turner had helped him with other things, too, and that had helped him get through the fractions and grammar and memorizing state capitals. Then there was Mrs. Castleberry, an adult that he had thought would just sail in and out of his life, until right this moment. She had the blue string, and that meant that she was important. He could feel the tears coming, and he didn't want them to. "It isn't his fault. He's been in a lot of pain since he fell off the truck." He told her the whole story, the abuse and all, and 1,000 excuses for his father besides. He made it pretty clear that he didn't blame his dad for any of this, and it must be the pain or his behavior, and not that his dad was a bad guy. He loved his dad, despite how he acted, and he remembered fondly the times they'd played catch or cars, or when he'd fixed his balsa wood glider with tape and they'd played airport in the backyard. He laid it all out, and when he was done, she said it would be okay and that she could fix it. He realized too late that the string was orange now, and that he had messed everything up. Mrs. Castleberry had called Child Protective Services, and that had been bad. They had called his parents to let them know that he was going into protective care, and that was worse. His dad had told him 100 times what happened to kids in CPS. Kids died there. Kids got worse than dead there, and Gerald knew that if he went, something bad would happen to him. They took him down to the Department of Children and Families in the big building downtown, the one you went to see the judge in. He sat in the same room as his parents and listened as Mrs. Castleberry told the CPS lady how she had noticed bruises as he tried so hard to hide them. She'd seen them, seen how he limped sometimes, but she had never had any solid proof. "When I saw the bruise around his eye, however, I know that someone had finally gone too far." Then Mr. Turner had come in, and Gerald realized that everyone had known, despite how much he had tried to hide it. It wasn't as bad when he was in my class. His father's accident wouldn't occur until the 3rd grade, but I saw them over the years. Bruises on his arms were hard to miss, especially when I worked so closely with him. Sometimes he winced when he sat down. Sometimes he limped a little, though he tried to hide it. But mostly it was the way he craved praise. When his eyes lit up, you could tell there wasn't a lot of praise at home. Sometimes, and it broke my heart to see it, he would flinch away from me when I would lift a hand to pat his shoulder or his back. Someone had been hurting him, but I had hoped it wasn't his father. He idolized his father. It was pretty easy to tell, and the thought that his hero was giving them these injuries was horrific. They had turned to Gerald then, wanting him to tell them what had happened. Mrs. Castleberry had prepared him for this. He would have to tell them what his father had done. Then he could be removed from the situation. He had hoped that maybe she would take him in, but she had shaken her head sadly when he suggested it and told him she wasn't in a position to take in children right now. "My apartment isn't big enough for me most of the time. No, very likely they'll put you in a foster home for a while. With any luck, your mother will prove a better caregiver than your father, and you can go back to living with her." "Just long enough for someone to mess you up worse than I ever could," the voice of his father had said in his head. His father had assured him that foster homes would make the torture he received at home look like child's play. They would break his bones. They would burn him. They would touch him in places the TV shows said they shouldn't be touched, and everything in between. He wouldn't have his mother there to take the beatings for him, and he would suffer constantly. Gerald didn't care, though. If it would get his father taken away so he couldn't hurt his mother or him anymore, then it would be worth it. He got up, prepared to tell them what had happened, but one look at his father, and the words curdled in his throat. He was smiling, his face a mask of serenity, and his eyes held all the crazy light of a desert hermit. Those eyes promised Gerald that no matter what he did, he'd find him. He could live with a family in the North Pole, could live with a family on the moon, and he would still find him. He would drag him home. He would kill whatever family was hiding him, and he would hurt Gerald worse than he ever had. Looking at him now, Gerald found he couldn't tell the truth. Looking at his father as he sat quietly across from him, Gerald was forced to fall back on his comfortable lies. Worst of all was the blue string that now connected the two of them. The blue string that let him know that his dear old dad was still good for something. I don't know what they're talking about. I fell down the stairs. I hurt myself. I'm accident prone. Please don't take me away from my family. I want to go home. I want to go home. Please, just let me go home." As he said it, Gerald maintained eye contact with his father, begging him not to hold a grudge and let him come home. The CPS officer only shrugged, telling the two teachers that without a witness, there was no crime. Gerald went home with his parents in the end, and Mr. Turner and Mrs. Castleberry stood watching him go like a mirror of his own parents. They didn't look angry at Gerald, only sad and worried about the boy that they had almost freed. Gerald blinked hard, his eyes heavy, but if he fell asleep now, he might never wake up again. The string was working its way back to blue, but if he was going to catch it, then he needed to be ready. Something about the string made him think that today was the day that something good was going to happen, and if he missed it, then it might be his last opportunity. He had to trust in the string. It had gotten him this far, and he really had nothing else to trust in. His father had waited till the trailer door closed, and then began his evening torture. Gerald was subject to a beating like nothing he had ever seen before, and all of it was topped off by the constant stream of demoralization that flowed from his father. He could smell the acrid smell of cooking meth, the burning plastic of a roasted extension cord mixed with the pissy smell of overcooked bleach and his own blood in his nose. He suddenly knew the source of his father's rage. He had stopped long enough to look sane for the meeting with the CPS, but now he was looking forward to beating his son, who had dared to defy him, and cap it off by knocking his wife around and pulling that poison into his lungs and falling into a drug-induced euphoria. Gerald had passed out on the floor that night, waking up in his bed the next morning to be informed that he had been taken out of school. He was homeschooled now, and would be for as long as it took anyone to forget that bruise, or his name, or anything else about him. That had been the first time that Gerald had tried to escape, he reflected with a yawn, and as he drifted off again, he also reflected that it wasn't the last. The door to the manager's trailer had come open relatively easy for someone the feds suspected of being the tri-state area's major supplier of methamphetamines. Tanner had expected a gun in his face or a snarling dog, hell, even a chain lock, but the door had crashed open after only a single kick to reveal a very empty office. The trailer was mostly for show, he suspected, and Vernon Graff, the drug kingpin of the trailer court, was likely shacked up with whatever bad-skinned waif he could find his way into. With the product he was supposed to be pumping out, she might even have half her teeth if he was lucky. Tanner and his less-than-eager accomplice had fallen on the filing cabinets in the adjoining room like flies on dung. The trailer court wasn't huge, maybe 50 units, and though Mr. Graff was a decent drug manufacturer, his bookkeeping was subpar. His debt records, however, were on point, and Tanner soon had the information that he was looking for. There were about 20 kids in the trailer court, some families even having more than one. The place was mostly for guys who worked at the steel mill or the paper mill, and the number of families here was surprisingly low. Of those 20 kiddos, about 12 of them were boys, the gender Ridley had designated. Of the 12, 4 were in high school, which put them right out, and 3 weren't in school at all, which also put them out. That left just 5 kiddos to go through. Not bad odds, all things considered. "We can start with the Neely house. It's 2 rows over," and Tanner began, before he was so rudely interrupted by the loud caw of an angry drunk. "What the hell is this?" came a voice from the front, presumably Vernon, after staggering in from whatever trailer he had been entertaining the night before. A quick look at his watch showed Tanner that it was nearly 5 a.m., and the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon just a little bit. They'd taken too long, even with Danvers' trained eye for info, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. He flicked his head at Danvers, telling him to get beside the door, and as Tanner drew his Glock and made ready, he felt that same stab of exhilaration shoot through him that always preceded violence. Maybe he'd have to hurt the guy, maybe even kill him. Danvers looked unsure as he held up his Sig Sauer in a shaking hand, but Tanner was cool as a cucumber. This was the work that he enjoyed. "When I catch you miserable sons of bitches, I swear to God I'll string you up in the yard. Is that you, Trevor, you coked up little slag? I swear to God, if you're trying to rob me, I'll bruise your face up so bad that none of your bears will want to..." He pushed the thin little door harder than he strictly needed to, and came into the office like a charging water buffalo. The door crashed into Danvers, the little man making a sound before bumping into the wall, and when Vernon Graff turned to see what it had been, Tanner hit him with the butt of his gun on the back of the head. A few minutes later, Vernon had an even ruder awakening as someone threw vodka in his face from a nearby mini-fridge. By then, he was tied into his office chair with extension cords, and the sun was less of an idea and more of a promise for the near future. Tanner wasn't a little guy, but it had taken him and Danvers both to get the bulk of the meth-dealing landlord into his chair. The vodka, he was hoping, would sting his eyes and make him less likely to ID the two, though that really didn't matter. When you worked for the Blacksite, your records looked like someone had gotten a little goofy with a black marker anyway. "Good morning, Mr. Graff," Danvers said, using his calm and delicate accountant's voice. "This won't take long. We just need to ask you a few..." Vernon Graff spat a lot of spittle and foul-smelling vodka into his face, and Danvers' next words were lost amongst a lot of coughing and huffing. "Screw you! You ain't got nothing! I ain't got nothing for you stupid druggos here! Get the hell out! Right now! Before I—" But his bluster was lost as the cold nose of Tanner's Glock found the thick and arthritis-kissed left knee that Vernon was bouncing without realizing it. The bouncing stopped as he spoke. "Looks like civility's off the table, Danny boy. Now then, Vern, either you answer my questions, or you will have to learn to chase trailer park jailbait and cook your poison with only one working knee. Do we have an understanding?" Vernon opened his broken-toothed maw, likely to deliver something angry and stupid that would leave him with a bullet wound, but he closed his lips around it and nodded instead. Well, Tanner thought, he'd be dipped. You can teach an old dog new tricks. "We're looking for a kid, about 10 or 11, who might possess some weird abilities. Nothing too weird. Maybe he moves stuff around. Maybe he guesses a little too well. Maybe he avoids you like the plague because he knows you're thinking about taking more than his lunch money." Vernon bristled again, but the cold nose of the gun doused his anger a bit. "Either way, we want him. We'll find him. The question is, are the cops going to find you with a sock in your mouth and tape holding it in, or a nice fat bullet hole in your skull? Either way, they'll never catch us. We're ghosts, Vern, and we don't catch easy." "I don't know nobody like that," Vern answered, too hastily, Tanner thought. "Think real hard, Vern," he said, taking the gun off his knee and putting it up against the fat waddle of his neck that covered his chin. "Think really hard, 'cause there's a 1911 in your desk drawer over there, and a 9mm slug is a 9mm slug, especially when the weapon's in your hand and the suicide note is so convincing." The gun shook, but it had nothing to do with Tanner's grip. "I don't know," Vern begged, beginning to cry big, greasy tears. "I don't know anyone like that. Kids around here are half inbred. They barely pass high school, let alone have weird powers. The McCluskey brat has a webbed foot. Forrester girl has a lazy eye. The Nemo brat has a colostomy bag 'cause his shitter doesn't work right. Is that what you're after? None of them are special, but you can take all of them. Only don't kill me. I don't want to..." He paused as Tanner reached up and pulled the slide back, ejecting a bullet which he caught and palmed. 10 seconds, Vernon. We can find him without you, but why not make it easy?" "I don't know," he wailed, afraid to move too much. The sound of a drawer opening roughly made him shudder. 9. "Brad Neary's kid has an eye for ball pitches," Vernon shuddered out. The cold barrel of the Glock went away, but it was replaced with the familiar barrel of the 1911. 8, Tanner intoned. The Glibson girl has a mouth like a Hoover," he practically squealed. 7, Tanner called, working the slide and checking for ammo. Just his luck, a full clip. 6, he said, Vernon reduced to blubbering by this point. 5, 4, 3, "Gerald Worley!" he screeched, holding his hands up as much as he could to stop the counting. "Couldn't hear that," Tanner said, wedging the gun into his wattles. "Want to try again?" "Gerald Worley," Vernon panted. "Milton Worley's kid. I've watched him follow weird paths like my grandma used to do with a divining rod when I was little. She was looking for water, but I don't know what this kid's looking for. Sometimes he seems to follow stuff only he can see. One time, I saw him follow it to a grate where he found $1 in time for the ice cream truck to roll by. I asked him once what he was doing, and he said he was following the strings. I don't know what that means, but it was so weird that it stuck with me, you know?" Tanner took the gun away, nodding as he thought about it. Gerald could see the ways that fate might take. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Graff," Tanner said, hitting him with the butt of his own gun hard enough to crack his skull. Vernon Graff wouldn't die, not that day, but he would spend a few days in the hospital after his secretary came in to find him unconscious and bleeding on the carpet a half hour later. Tanner's prints wouldn't be found anywhere, and the whole thing would be chalked up to a robbery. Vernon would be very vocal about how they had been the ones to abduct Gerald Worley, probably hoping for a reward of some kind. Whether they believed him or not, Gerald would be long gone by then. Gerald snorted awake, cursing himself for falling asleep. The blue string was probably throbbing now, and as he got out of bed, he was through the hole and under the skirting in a heartbeat. He had his bag, his meager possessions, and a thick blue string to guide him. This was it. This was his destiny. He was going to make it out of here. He was going to... The string led into the road, and that's how the white panel van came to be in his path, just in time for him to run smack dab into it. The only two more surprised than Gerald were Agents Danver and Agent Tanner. They had quite literally run smack into the boy that they were looking for, and the hit had been hard enough to knock him out cold. Gerald would come awake in a very different bed, surrounded by strangers, to the sound of a little girl crying. Gerald was the last student of this year's kindergarten class, and school was about to be in session. It was the strangest thing, but this is definitely the kid that Graff was talking about. Security Chief Ridley smiled, the effect enough to make his old students' blood run cold when they had reason to see it. You'd be surprised how many times things like this happen in our line of work. He was thinking about another potential kindergarten alumni who was coming in with his dropout mother, the two finally reunited after so long. These coincidences were normal for people in their line of work. "Even so," Danvers said, trying to make the conversation sound normal, but letting his trepidation slip through, "I'd wager that not many other snatch squads have the targets run into their transport and knock themselves out." Ridley nodded. That one was different. He let the silence slip by, knowing it would make Danver uncomfortable and wanting to hear him squirm a little. Charles Danver had been a squirmy little maggot when he had taken up residence at the site, a small child who had been hard to break of pissing his pants and stuttering ceaselessly. His parents had been more than happy to get rid of him, and Ridley had been happy to take him in. For a worm, he spoke like a king when he needed to, and he was a whiz with numbers. Even so, Ridley liked to listen to him squirm. "So, anyway, we should be back at the site in 48 hours. We have enough drugs to keep him under, and his head injury looks superficial at best." "For your sake, Danny boy, I hope so. If that kid dies of a brain bleed, then you can be my newest student in the kindergarten. Imagine how silly you'll look trying to fit in with the kids, barely in middle school." Danver laughed, but there was no humor behind it. "Till then," Ridley said, and hung up on him before he could respond. Looking at the roster on his computer, he ticked another box and smiled as a result. Of the 25 potential students, they had received 20. That was pretty good. 80% was well within parameters, but he had conducted class with less. By the end, there would be less anyway, and that too was expected and acceptable. He would burn them out, they would take their own lives, some might even kill each other. This was expected and acceptable. "This year's class will be most interesting," Ridley said, the lights of the screen turning his glasses into a glare-blind window. He had no idea how prophetic those words would be. Hey everyone, it's your favorite security guard again. Winter is fast approaching here at the Cashmere Botanical Gardens, and the tourists are really flocking to see the exhibits we have. The lady's outdone herself with some of the wonders here, and with our new grove, complete with Guardian, admission has gone through the roof. There's also the living wood display, the toxic fauna room, the collection of tropical specimens grown right here on the premise, and the island of lilies that still holds the stone form of our founder. Today, however, I'm here to talk about a problem that's been cropping up from members of security lately. I'm speaking, of course, about the gnomes. Now, when people talk about gnomes, you have a certain idea of what they should look like, don't you? You think about colorful clothes and pointy hats and little white beards and cheery expressions. Maybe you think about short little creatures that scuttle around in the tall grass and hide from people. If that's what you're thinking, then you couldn't be further from the truth. I had seen them before, but I had no idea what they were. They didn't exactly look the way you would expect. Gnomes kind of resemble a ginseng root that's learned to walk. They're thick-bodied and brown, with strange red eyes and a mouthful of wiggly teeth. They don't wear clothes, but it doesn't seem to be much of a problem, because they don't have anything to cover. They dig through the dirt like moles and have been eating the vegetables in our garden by the handful. That was my first encounter with them, actually. I was coming on shift, making my way towards the gardens after stopping a bunch of tourists from trampling a display as they took pictures, when something bumped into my shin. I looked down and found the ugly little thing running from the gardens with carrots under its arms. It made a face at me. No mean feat for something that barely has a head. Martin, one of the other Brandylow, came tearing after it, yelling about vegetable thieves with a bleat and a clop of his hooves. The thing grabbed its spoils and beat feet, rounding a hedge as it fled into the garden. Martin huffed as he came even with me, out of breath and sweating as he pushed his glasses back on his face. "Damn things! The hell was that?" I asked. "No idea. They showed up this morning and started eating everything they could lay hands on." He went back to work then, the little creature long gone, and I went back to patrolling the grounds. There had been a lot of strange things lately. Trees with human faces and pumpkin-headed minions that had delivered war proclamations. But it was all sort of becoming normal by this point. I moved towards the Colors of Spring exhibit and found a few visitors watching something at work inside the ring. As I came up, an older man approached me, pointing and saying that there was some kind of animal in the exhibit. "It looks like one of those naked mole rat things. It's ruining your flower display." Sure enough, as I watched, something kept yanking the buds from beneath the ground. As it came up to eat them, I saw the horrid little thing that had been stealing carrots, though I knew it couldn't be the same one. As another popped up as well, I gritted my teeth. There was more than one of them, likely a lot more, and as I waded into the display, I wasn't certain I could get my hands on them. They looked unpleasant, and as I reached into the hole, I felt one of them latch onto my hand with its knobbly little teeth. As I yanked my hand out and looked at the weird little bites, I was even less certain that I could catch them. After some time spent digging, I was left with nothing to show but dirty knees and filthy hands. With nothing to show for my efforts, I went back to talk to Randy about it. Randy, however, was already aware of them. "Yeah, they've been wrecking up the place all day. They just kind of showed up yesterday and have been a real pain in the ass ever since." In the short time they had been here, they had eaten up most of the crops, wrecked up several of the exhibits, and made Rayffered very upset after causing damage to his grove. They had Been seen by quite a few guests, too, and that was something that would be harder to explain. We had to keep a low profile while we were here, so as not to scare our customers. We would give our lives to protect the lady, but she had decreed that we cover our hooves and keep our natures a secret for as long as possible, and these gnomes were going to mess that up. Looking over the reports, it didn't look good. So what do we do about them? I asked, watching the cameras and noticing more of them roaming around the park. I don't see any way around it, Randy said. We got to talk to the lady. Before we could set out, though, someone else wanted our help. Randy, someone yelled, their fists preceding their words by a heartbeat. Randy, there are gnomes destroying my greenhouse. We opened the door to find Tobias in a real state. Tobias was responsible for the greenhouses that bred the rare species seen in the park. He was a talented botanist or something, and he was one of the older brandylow that the lady had brought with her. He wasn't usually prone to outbursts, and if he was here, then it meant that something bad was happening back at the greenhouses. Gnomes? Randy asked. Like the little things that sit in people's yards? Tobias rolled his eyes. That's rubbish, human nonsense. Gnomes are servants of the lady, but they're running amok, and they won't listen to me. I need your help before they ruin the samples I'm growing in the special housing area. Randy grabbed his club, a big iron-headed thing that the lady had given him as a symbol of his authority, and his shotgun because you could never be too careful. Those of us who considered ourselves to be under Randy's authority, the guards from before the Botanical Garden had changed hands, carried shortened clubs with metal heads on them as well, and I drew mine out as the three of us headed off to see what was going on. What we found was pure pandemonium. The greenhouse was full of the little things. They were stuffing everything that grew into their mouths, and the brandylow that worked here were chasing them around as they tried to protect the various projects. I remembered wondering how many there were, and now I could see the breadth of what we were dealing with. The ground was thick with them, something like 100 or more, swarming like ants over everyone and everything. They moved atop the brandylow as well, swarming them beneath their sheer numbers, and I looked at Brandy as he blew out a short breath in frustration. What are we gonna do? Like you have to ask, he said, swinging the shotgun behind him on the cord around his shoulder. We gotta get rid of them. As we moved among them, our clubs swung in a wide arc. We didn't seem to be doing much to them, our clubs smacking them but doing no lasting trauma to the little buggers. They were like dolls, their body full of smushy nothing, and they absorbed everything and came back stronger. For every one that we knocked aside, 2 more came on. We were slapped, bitten, stomped on by more feet than I'd ever seen before. Their teeth were mushy, but within lay a core like stone. They ground against us as we tried to stop them, but we weren't without options. Randy began tossing them out the door, bouncing them out of the greenhouse after ripping them off of our arms and legs. It didn't stop them from coming right back, but it seemed more like Randy enjoyed bouncing them off the ground than anything. Randy said a lot of things I really can't say here in a family-friendly setting, but when they stopped trying to bury us beneath their numbers, we both looked up to find our benefactor standing at the door of the greenhouse. She looked amused, but there was definitely some annoyance behind it. What is the meaning of this? The gnomes stopped moving, all of them turning beady eyes on the immaculate lady. Tobias was with her, standing behind her flowery dress like a little kid, and as she came inside, he looked at the sea of gnomes like a younger sibling who's tattled on someone naughty. He needn't have bothered, though. The gnomes had all stopped where they stood, bowing and scraping as they showed abeyance to their lady. From their ranks came an older gnome, wrinklier and more bent than the others. He bent low before her, and when he spoke, it sounded like one of those chipmunks from an old cartoon show. "My lady, we've found you at last." "Vladimir, My old friend, why did you not come to me immediately when you arrived?" The old gnome looked up, and though contrite, he still had the gleam of mischief about him.
"1,000 pardons, my lady. We were hungry from our long trip, and were trying to feed our masses, so we might seek you out."
The lady nodded, not convinced in the least bit, but mollified nonetheless. "Well, since you're full now, I have work for your kind. Come with me, but you must be cautious. The people here do not know of your kind, as I do, and they do not trust what they do not know. You must remain hidden, as my Brandylow do, and out of sight. The winter approaches, and I will have need of you and your little ones to spy on my enemies." The gnomes went with her, and they caused minimal trouble after that. There were still vegetables missing from time to time, and some of the exhibits were chewed on some, but the gnomes did help now and then, and were ever the eyes of the summer lady. The guests were not bothered by them. Most of the gnomes weren't even seen by daylight, and we entered a shaky alliance with them. Some of the Brandylow, though Toby was not amongst them, were even glad to see them, telling us of times they had helped them win battles or plot the movements of winter with their spy network. "You're too young to know much of the coming war, but you'll discover it soon enough," Marshall told us one evening as we sat about the fire. "In times of war, a spy network is often worth its weight in gold, or, in the gnome's case, fresh produce and consternation. So if you visit the park, do not fear the stubby potato people that you may or may not see. The gnomes are the least dangerous thing that make Cashmere Botanical Gardens their home, and certainly not what you should be keeping an eye peeled for." I'm a cop in Nevada, for a tiny town of less than 1,000. Courtney, Nevada doesn't actually have a police force. The mayor is usually whoever's soberest at election time, and it's made up of retirees and people trying not to be noticed. It lies between Austin and Eureka, and the whole town is managed by a single officer, me. I live in Eureka, but 3 months out of the year, I stay in the dingy little Palmer Inn and operate the emergency phone system. It routes to my cell phone, and when I'm not out on a call, I can be found in my room, watching TV. The Palmer actually gets really good satellite TV. You probably think it sounds like a post from hell, but the crime rate in Courtney is next to nothing. I've been doing this on and off for about 3 years, and I think I've only had to reach for my gun twice in that time. We do 3 months on, and then swap with another officer for 3 months, but sometimes I'll just do 6 months in a row. Courtney is as peaceful as a town full of oldsters and whatever else can be. After tonight, however, I'm not sure I can look at the place the same way again. I'm trying to write up paperwork now, but I'm just not sure what to say. There's no way they'll believe the truth, but I swear it's what happened. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. I'm hoping that if I write it out here, then it might be easier to explain to my supervisor. I was sitting out on the town line with my radar gun at about 10:30 at night, when the quiet town suddenly got less quiet. So the only thing really to do in Courtney to justify me being there is to catch speeders on Highway 50. The speed zone changes from 65 to 35 in the course of a mile, and the number of drivers that seem to think they can just blow through the little town doing 60 is way too damn high. I had a rig of my own invention that held the speed gun up to the window, and as good a hiding place as I could behind an old billboard, leaving me basically unseen and my hands free to watch whatever on my phone. I had foregone the adventures of Luffy and the crew in favor of a new horror podcast, and I was getting comfy when something hit the ground hard enough to rock my cruiser in its frame. My phone fell into the floorboard about a second before the speed gun came down to hit me on the head, and I came out of my car rubbing my scalp and cussing like a sailor. I got out and looked across the street, seeing heat shimmers as something cooled in the desert nearby. The oldsters who lived here had told me that meteors were sometimes seen falling out into the desert, but this one had damn near taken my cover out. I had never seen a meteor up close, not unless you count the ones at the museum that my school had drugged the class to when I was a kid, and I was interested in getting a good look. It would be kinda cool to see something that had been cruising through space until a few minutes ago, and I made my way across the road and towards the crater. I was still in the road when, to my surprise, I heard the sound of metal grating against itself. I could see the top of something dark as it rose from the lip of the crater, and the top was still glowing from its entry through the atmosphere. The hole wasn't terribly deep, but this would have still been taller than me by a foot. Would have been a shame if one of those aforementioned speeders had come blowing through while not paying attention, because I would have been roadkill. I was about 60 feet from it, but it looked like one of those NASA spacesuits, except made out of silver. When it moved, it was the herky-jerky kind of steps of a sci-fi robot. You know, the ones you might see in a 50s movie. It slipped in the sand a little, but managed to find its footing as it made its slow way out of the crater. If it noticed me, it gave no sign, and when it came to the top of the hole, it turned and started making its way for town. I hadn't noticed before it got on solid ground, probably because the sand was running down to quench it, but when it stepped, its footsteps left little fires behind. It made it easier to follow, and as I went back to the cruiser to get my radio, I realized I had no one to call right about the time I keyed up the mic. I was here by myself. I was the law in Courtney, and it was up to me to do something about this. I dropped the handset and climbed in instead, keying the engine as I pulled out and followed the strange creature that had crashed randomly on the outskirts of the little burg. It wasn't hard to follow him. His feet left little fires behind him, and his pace was slow, as if he weren't really in a hurry, as he made his way closer and closer to town. Watching him go, I wasn't really sure what to do with him if I tried to stop him. Could he be stopped with anything in my car? I had a shotgun, my sidearm, and a couple of those flashbangs we used on large groups of people. None of that seemed like it would do much against this metal man who was slowly making his way through the desert. Watching him move was like watching a stop-motion short. He was kind of a strange automaton, a metal man whose skin was still slightly red from his fall from space. Instead of pulsing and burning, as his steps had, he seemed to shimmer like a heat reflection. He didn't seem lost, his pilgrimage definitely going in a certain direction, and as the lights of the quick fill broke the darkness with their phosphorescent intrusion, I began to get a little nervous. The quick fill was a 24/7 gas station that boasted 12 gas pumps and a huge underground holding tank. God only knew what would happen if this thing set fires that went down to the reserve tank. I whipped into the parking lot as I popped the trunk and grabbed my shotgun. It had buckshot in it, a higher caliber than the 9mm slug in my Glock, and when I hefted it, it felt like I had 4 shells ready and waiting. There was a box of 12 in the trunk, and I put them in my jacket pocket before chambering around and taking the safety off. I didn't know what this thing was capable of, but I knew I couldn't let it menace my town. "You, all right, Sheriff?" Came a shaky voice from the door of the quick fill, and it startled me enough to almost make me drop my shotgun. Clyde Haggerty, the 19-year-old kid who ran the register at the quick fill after 10:30 p.m., looked pretty scared. He had probably watched me come screeching in, pop the trunk, and go digging for my shotgun, wondering what the hell was going on. In his mind, it was probably robbers or dopers, but he had no clue what was coming out of the desert for him. I didn't want him to see this thing suddenly vaporize me with a death ray or something, and when I turned towards him, he jumped back a little as the barrel of my shotgun flagged him. "Go get yourself somewhere safe, Clyde. Something's heading your way, and I don't want you to get mixed up with it." Clyde nodded, and I heard the door click as he went back inside. Hopefully, he was hiding in the cooler or something. I turned back to find the creature lumbering closer, its distance now about 50 feet from me. The shotgun wouldn't do much at that range, but that would give me enough time to follow protocol and give it a warning before opening fire. "Stop! I'm an officer of the Eureka Police Department, and I'm ordering you to halt and state your intent." The creature didn't even pause, just kept its course as it made for the gas station. "Stop! This is your final order to stop, or I will open fire." It was well within range now, the fires burning behind it, making it hard to miss, and when I squeezed the trigger, the gun bucked as the shot slammed into it. The metal man never slowed in his pursuit, and as I loaded another round, it was now about 20 feet from me. "Stop!" I yelled, squeezing the trigger and pumping a new shell into the barrel as the old one thundered forth. A third shot let fly a second later, but if the creature was even registering them, it never showed it. It kept coming as I fed new shells into the gun, and as I slid the fourth into the receiver, I felt a sudden and excruciating heat. It was like standing too close to a bonfire, and as I stumbled away from the thing, I looked up to find that it was within 10 feet of me. It appeared that it was still very hot, and its skin radiated an intense heat that the sand had done nothing to quench. I yelped again as my fingers blistered, and I realized the gun was soaking up as much heat as I was. I tossed it down, and not a moment too soon either. The bullets in the weapon began to erupt, sending the shotgun flying apart. As I turned away and covered my face just in time, I caught some shrapnel in the arm and a little in the back, but I was spared the worst of it. As it lumbered past, I tossed the shells out too, lobbing them as far as I could manage before they went off as well. Even so, I was reminded of a time as a kid when I'd reached for something underneath the radiator while it was still on. Even though I'd been careful not to touch it with my face or hands, I could still feel that heat coming off of it as I stretched for a toy that I had lost under there. It was like that now, except this thing was a walking radiator. It went right past me and towards the gas station, its course unerring. As it came around the side, I remembered another weapon at my disposal and ran back to the trunk of the cruiser. I had a fire extinguisher in there, one of the big ones that I'd needed to put out a trash fire once, and as the creature came around to the front of the store, I pulled the pin and sprayed it with a stream of foam. It coated the thing, hissing as it hit its superheated skin and sliding off like the cheese on those copper pans they're always showing on TV. It was impossible to tell if it was doing anything, but as I played it out, I heard a hellish sound coming from the front of the store. The thing had reached out and melted the glass on the double doors, walking through the hole as it went right into the quick fill. There wasn't much I could do but follow him. I didn't know where Clyde was, but I hoped that he was safe. The store looked empty as I followed at a relatively safe distance, and the front counter was vacant. It appeared that Clyde had taken me seriously, and as the creature stumbled into the little shop, I found myself spraying at fires left in its passing. He went by the chips, the candy, the snack cakes, all of them curling a little as the heat kissed them. He was making his slow way towards the drink cooler, and he seemed to be looking for something in particular. As he stood looking in, the floor bowed and sagged beneath his otherworldly warmth. I was worried that he would go right through the floor at this rate. When he reached out, slowly and deliberately, his hand melted its way into the cooler, and the puff of angry, cold air that came out was almost comical. It hissed against the creature's skin as it reached in for something, and when it came out with a bottle of Dr. Pepper, the container was already starting to warp. It tilted it towards its head, spilling the dark liquid all over itself, before reaching for another one. By the third bottle, they had stopped crumpling quite so quickly, and by the seventh, it was clear that it was tossing the liquid into whatever served as its mouth. It ran through the whole row of them before starting on the Diet Dr. Peppers, and as it finished the row too, I noticed its skin was less translucent than before. Some of the heat shimmer had left it, some of the blazing warmth had dissipated. It was cooling down, and as it dropped the mostly intact bottles to the ground, It released a very human sigh of relief. Then it fell to pieces on the floor of the quickfill, its body reduced to scrap. And that was the end of my encounter. I'm still not sure what to make of all this. The creature landed on Earth, tromped through the desert, destroyed my shotgun, wrecked up the quickfill, and then drank until he turned into scrap metal. Dr. Pepper, to be exact, but who's counting? I don't know if my supervisors will accept this or not, but I do have something they can use as proof, besides the crater on the outskirts of town. Every step that he took through the desert left behind a perfect little footprint of pure glass, and the glass has a tread in it. I've saved a few of them, just in case, and Clyde has provided a witness statement as well. Apparently he was hiding in the cooler when the creature came in, and saw it drink all the Dr. Pepper before collapsing. Hopefully, that'll be enough to convince my supervisors I'm not crazy. But I hope to never have another night like that one again. Something else comes to mind too, and it makes me hesitant to go to the fridge for my favorite midnight drink of choice. If my fire extinguisher did little more than kick up steam, what's in Dr. Pepper that quenched his heat so well? Camber and Sons was indeed glad to see me. The interview process was pretty straightforward. I had been swinging an axe since I was a kid, and logging was basically a historical course for us at school. The teachers knew when many of us graduated, we'd be going into the logging trade. Rayffered only had one real industry, after all. We learned from a young age how to keep the forest at bay, how to use the woods to further the growth of the town, and how to avoid the foresters. I tried to pay attention to Wendell Camber, the current Camber of Camber and Sons, as he asked me about my time in the war, but my eyes kept going back to the poster behind his desk, the one of the shadowy figures that lumbered the streets by night. Beware the foresters, it said, and follow all the rules set by the town elders. This was something we had all grown up with, and it was a sign that I'd seen since my earliest time in school. "Sorry," Wendell said, after the third time I'd gotten distracted. "I know the war is probably a sore subject. I was just curious. I didn't mean any disrespect." "None taken," I said simply. "I guess I'm still a little shell-shocked. I think I really just need something to occupy my time. Being still makes me pretty anxious, and an anxious soldier is waiting for an accident." Wendell laughed, nodding like he understood completely. "I can understand that. Hell, I spent my last vacation waiting for it to be over. Sometimes the woods just call to you, and it's hard to ignore that call." He looked towards the little window of the trailer that his office had, and I was sure that he was hearing the call of something. "Anyway, your dad tells me that you've got some kind of injury in the service." He tapped the side of his head. "Anything that might make the job difficult?" I shook my head. Truth be told, I think I would have been fine to return to combat, but the docs didn't want to risk it. Loud noises don't bother me, neither does a hard day's work for long hours. "And foresters?" he asked, looking over the clipboard with a questioning look. "What about 'em?" I said, preparing for the coming question. "I know they took your brother. Any lingering animosity?" I had to work hard not to laugh at him. Lingering animosity? They had taken my older brother, and I suspected that they may have made him like them. Lingering animosity. Yeah, I suppose there was some of that, but I didn't want to tell that to Wendell Camber. Wendell Camber would likely know a little something about lingering animosity, since the foresters had taken two of his cousins and his father a couple of years before. His dad, Joseph Camber, had been sick and dying of the same aggressive cancer that was taking Tyler's dad, and his time was getting short. The scuttlebutt was that he had been staring at the woods from the back porch of his house, and his wife had found the back door open and his clothes on the backyard grass. He had never been seen again, but Wendell was still hopeful that they would stumble across his remains. "That's ancient history now," I assured him. "Besides, what would I do if hard feelings did persist? The Foresters are undying. How exactly would I do anything to them in the first place?" He nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer. "Well, the work ain't glamorous, but it's honest work. We work Monday through Friday, sun up to about an hour before sunset. We have optional work on Saturdays. Sundays are always an off day, in case you want to go to church or something. We have a position open with Garza's crew if you're interested. You can start tomorrow, if you like, in fact." We discussed pay, I signed some contracts, and then we sealed it with a handshake. And just like that, I was a logger. Dad was all smiles when he came home, and when he brought me a care package after dinner, I suspected that I knew what was in it. It's one of my old jumpsuits and a harness, some work gloves, a hard hat. The boots, he said as he pitched his voice low, are new, however. Don't tell your mother. She wanted me to give you an old pair of mine. I thanked him, my desert boots looking a little ragged next to the thick brown work boots that Dad had put at the bottom of the package. "I always hoped that one of you boys would join me in the woods," he said, sounding a little teary-eyed. "I honestly felt a little selfish for it, though. I was hoping both of you would do better than your old man, but after Simon was..." He stopped then, trying to compose himself, but put a hand on his shoulder. "I know, Dad. Thank you for the gear. It'll make me look like less of a greenhorn than I am," I said with a laugh. "Learn everything you can from Garza," he said with a smile. "I would have liked to have had you in Garrett's crew, but you could do far worse than Garza's bunch. He's a tough supervisor, but he cares for his guys and he teaches them right. Learn everything you can. Work hard, and you'll get everything you put into this job." He was so proud of me as he walked off, telling me to get some sleep since I had a big day tomorrow. I almost wanted to call him back and tell him what I was planning, ask him on his opinion on trying to get Simon back. I couldn't do that to him, though. Dad had waited years for this, and if he knew my plans, then he would make it that much harder for me to get into his crew. The outfit my dad was with went the deepest, deeper than any of the others, and if I was going to get to the Grove, then I would need to sign on with one of those guys. They wouldn't sign on a greenhorn to go into the deep woods, and I knew that I was going to be working the outskirts to start with. After some time, they might ask me if I wanted to join one of the bigger crews, but for now, I needed to impress Garza and learn as much as I could. Impressing my new boss, however, wouldn't prove as hard as I thought. I arrived at the lumber yard just after first light the next day, my coffee in one hand and my lunchbox in the other. Dad had rummaged out one of his old boxes, and I had a carabiner on it so that I could hook it to my harness if I needed to. Some old-timers were keeping a wary eye peeled, but most of the loggers were just now showing up. We started to filter off into smaller groups, and Dad patted my shoulder as he pointed me to a small group by the foreman's shack. "I believe that's your crew. Good luck, son." He moved off, waving at some of his crewmates, and I went to stand with the small group of greenhorns. Most of them were as new to this as I was, and I saw a lot of fresh jumpsuits and nervous talk. This was a lot like the first day of school before you make friends or join teams and clubs, and I was waiting for someone to make the first move. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little nervous, as strange as that sounds, given that I'd just come from an active war zone. Sometimes the unknown is scarier than any war, and I was getting ready to head into the truest unknown. One of the old-timers walked over, and I could tell by his stride and the way that he held himself that I wasn't the only one who'd spent some time in the service. "Okay, boys," the man said, his name stitch indicating him as Garza. "Grab your gear and let's head out. Oh," he said, noticing me, "suppose we got a new face. Make him feel welcome. Show him where his stuff is. Derek," he said. One of the others stopped to look at him. "Show him the ropes. Show him where Tank's stuff is. It's his now." Derek nodded, offering me a hand as we headed towards the shed. "You the war hero?" he asked, as he took me to a cubby with equipment in it, and my name hastily taped across the top. I'm no hero. I was in the army, though. My squad used to call me Wood, since I told them I came from the forest, so I guess you guys can call me that too if you like. Cool. You can take Tank's old stuff. He won't be needing it anymore, he said with a little sigh. There was an axe, a tool belt, a chainsaw, and an assortment of saws in a bag. The chainsaw was already gassed up, and the stuff looked brand new. The belt was barely stained, the tools were still shiny, and I wondered how long Tank had been with the outfit. Furthermore, I wondered why Tank had left the outfit, and if it was entirely his idea. So what happened to Tank? I asked, as I hooked on the gear. He move or something? Derek sucked in his cheeks, but he knew it wouldn't do any good to pussyfoot around it. Forrester's got him. We found his belt at the wood line, and that's the only reason you got it. I blew out of breath, feeling like I should have guessed. Shit, sorry, man, I wasn't thinking. Derek brightened a little, slapping me lightly on the back. Not your fault, Wood. Come on, Garza usually likes to leave before it gets too late. We piled into the back of the truck, the six of us making a tight fit with our gear, and away we went. We stopped in a sleepy suburb, and as the boss climbed out, we all climbed out to get our assignments. The neighborhood looked abandoned, the trees growing up as close as they dared, and it was clear they dared a lot. Some of the houses had trees growing inside them, the backyards looking like small forests themselves, and I doubted that we would disturb anyone with our cutting. City wants us to cut the woods back here, make the neighborhood livable again. If the trees are in the yards, we cut them down without damaging the houses. If they're in the houses, mark the door with a red X and move on. The houses are not as important to the city as cutting the trees back. We're shooting for 3 days, so watch for fog and keep an eye on the sun. We broke off into pairs, and Derek and I set to cutting back the thick brush around several of the houses close to the work truck. The others spread out in a haphazard pattern as they used their chainsaws to trim back the greenery, pushing it back into the forest. The woods looked foreboding, the pavement starting to show cracks as the roots poked free. The trees here were young, barely more than saplings, but they'd pushed their way into the urban space with little effort. I'd never seen the trees get this close, but I knew that there were several lumber outfits in town, and all of them were on retainer when it came to keeping the woods cut back. This is really about all we do, Derek said, over the sound of his chainsaw, as I pushed a small tree down. I've been with the outfit for a year, and we've cut this neighborhood back at least once before. How do they grow so fast? I asked, pushing the small tree with my foot as we stacked them. No one knows, Derek said, as he slid binders around the stack. They just do. The forest wants the town pretty badly. Seems like all we do is try to keep it back. By lunchtime, we had a tidy pile of young-growth trees, and as we munched our sandwiches and wraps and such, I asked why we use chainsaws to keep the forest back. What you mean? Derek asked, spraying chip crumbs. What else would we use? I mean, why not burn back the forest? I asked, thinking of watching the fire consume the sea of green that had threatened us. Derek coughed like he'd been punched in the guts, and the others looked worried like my idea might be catching. Wood, you can't use fire in the woods. Everyone knows that. Why not? I asked. 'Cause it attracts the foresters, came a deep voice from my left. Garza had set up a chair under the shade of a carport, and he came towards our group as he chewed his po' boy. He didn't look pleased with our line of discussion and wanted to squash it. Didn't they teach you why you don't use fire in the forest in school? It's been tried more than a few times, and it never ends well. The fire seems to make the foresters angry, and the fog rolls in to stop it. Anyone around the fire is never seen again, and the damage seems to disappear once the fire's gone. I would have thought your father would have told you about the dangers of fire. He was involved in the 95 burning near the deep woods. I shook my head, unable to take my eyes off the grizzled logger as he continued. There's always someone who thinks they know best, but they usually just lead to a lot of strife and a lot of openings at whatever company they're working for. We use the tools that we've always used, and we do the best that we can to keep the forest at bay. Speaking of, lunch is passed over. Time to get back to work." He went back to the overhang to get his gear, and as we moved off to the adjacent yard, we all cleaned up our mess and followed suit. By the end of the first day, I was tired. It was nice to have full-time work again. It felt like a while since I'd done anything worthwhile, and as I put my chainsaw in the back of the truck, I felt a sense of fulfillment wash through me. I could do this. I could work my way up through the ranks and get to the grove. Derek had told me that we'd made a lot of progress, as the boss called, an end of the day, and I was excited to see what tomorrow would bring. I was climbing into the back of the truck when Garza called me by name. "Ride in the cab with me. I want a word." Everyone looked at me like I'd done something wrong, and as I climbed in and shut the door, I was worried I was about to come in for an ass chewing. We were driving away from the site, and when he rumbled out laughter, I realized I must have looked worried. "Don't fret, son. This ain't a dressing down. I just wanted to talk to you and see how your first day went. You're a hard worker, which is more than I can say for some of the old-timers kids. It's good to have you on the crew." I breathed a sigh of relief as I realized that this was a getting-to-know-my-employees kind of talk. It was fine. It was nice to get back out there and do some work again. I'd been feeling like a couch potato since I got home. Ah, yes. It's always hard to return to civilian life, especially after you've been in the thick of it. Your dad says you were in the Army. I was in the Marines, and it was hard to find my niche after Vietnam. I perked up a little after finding out he was a combat vet. "You were in Vietnam?" 2 tours. At the start of the war, and then again towards the end, right before we pulled out. It was a senseless war, but I never regretted my service. Cutting trees is definitely a little different from an active combat zone. Oh, not as different as you'd think, especially around here. There are enemies to keep an eye on, objectives to obtain. The forest is an enemy that we beat our heads against ceaselessly. It's a war that we'll never win, no matter how hard we fight. We can only hold back the inevitable and hope to keep people safe." One of the guys in the back laughed, and Garza glanced back at the 5 young guys in the truck bed with something almost fatherly. "Jameson back there was in the Navy, you know. Served on a ship about the same time you did. He did his 4 years and decided to come cut trees instead of working the flight deck. Ramsey was in Desert Storm, though he probably doesn't look old enough to have been alive then. Your new friend Derek is a boot camp washout, and he had some pretty bad asthma as a kid. It's a wonder he made it through the physical fitness portion. Clancy's an active guardsman, goes out on maneuvers a couple of times a year, does his training most weekends." I couldn't help but chuckle as I looked back at the old Marine. You seem to have quite a collection of military excellence here. He gave me a hard look as if he was trying to decide whether I was mocking his crew or not, but must have decided I was just poking fun. I try my best to get the ex-military guys, give them a quiet place to land, but it's more than that. I feel like it's my duty to keep them safe, keep them secure, at least until they're ready to watch for themselves. The woods are dangerous. I think all of them know that, but they're used to being able to fight off that danger. Most of them had never encountered a forester, not like you and I have, and they don't understand that it isn't an enemy that can be fought. My ears perked up a little at that. You've seen one too, then? Garza nodded. Maybe I'll tell you about it sometime. It's probably the reason I ended up going into the service. The desire to save people. We were getting close to the lumber yard now, and as we pulled in, I felt good about the group. I'd found myself a home, it seemed. In many ways, it was like being back with my squad in the sandbox. "Before you go," he said, the others piling out of the truck as it came to rest, "I want to tell you that the fire discussion wasn't meant to make you feel singled out. I thought everyone knew not to use fire near the woods, and I wanted to put any thoughts of using it out of your mind. It's a tool that can easily get out of control, but it's also something that seems to make the foresters furious. Your dad and I saw that firsthand in '95, and I don't ever want to see something like that again." I nodded, knowing better now. "What happened?" I said, before I could stop myself. I didn't think he was going to answer for a minute, but when he did, I wished I hadn't asked. "Your dad and I ran for our lives, that's what happened. We ran, and we didn't look back. Somehow we made it out alive. We're the only ones who did, and I think they were more interested in getting the person who'd set the fire than us. Something I don't like to think about, but it's something I dream about pretty often." We sat there for a few minutes, just listening to the truck tick, before I said I'd see him tomorrow and went to get my gear. That was my first day with Camber and Son, and with a group of roughnecks I would come to be very close with. It was my first day, but far from my last. It was Saturday, and I had decided to use my weekend to do some research. I've been working for Camber and Son for about a month now, but it seemed like I'd been there no time at all some days. Have you ever had a job where you just instantly mesh with the people there? You find yourself forming inside jokes, easily forming friendships, without any real effort, maybe even feeling like you've always been there. That was how I felt while I was on Garza's crew. They had all been members of one military branch or another, and all of us had seen different struggles that had included combat for many of us. But the experience had made us grateful for each other, especially as we now seemed to be fighting a very different war. My secret designs, however, sometimes made me feel like a spy rather than a soldier. What would my new friends say if they knew what I was planning? What would they think if they knew my goals? These were things I hadn't even shared with my father, and I knew I was likely to find myself asked to leave not only Camber and Son, but likely the town if they came to light. If I was going to go into the woods, however, I would need to be prepared. This wasn't something I could do half-cocked, and that would take knowledge and time. I had already decided that going into the deep woods alone would be a mistake. I had lived here all my life, but, as I'm sure will come as no surprise to you, the woods were not a place where parents encourage their kids to play. You could get picked up right off the street by the foresters. Going into the place they lived seemed like a great way to never come home again. Very few people who didn't work with the Deep Wood outfit knew much about the forest or the foresters, and it seemed that would be my first hurdle. Despite most people having never met one, there were rules in place that every child knew from a young age. I've talked about them a bit, but I don't think I really believed in them until Simon got snatched. But we all followed the rules like good kids, regardless. Most of it was that our parents believed in them, and they made sure that we knew what would happen if we didn't follow the rules. Ah yes, the rules. Don't go out after dark. If it's foggy, don't go out at all. If the fog suddenly appears, stand absolutely still until it passes. If you see a forester, don't run. Stand perfectly still until they leave. You could see them all over town, and after being gone for a while, it was a little jarring to see them again. They hung right next to posters for yard sales and band recitals, and the contrast was something you never really got used to. Walking up the sidewalk as I made my way for Susan's bookstore, I caught sight of one as it flapped merrily on the glass of the old hardware store. It must be new because someone had added the line, "Be safe this holiday season," to the bottom. Whether they meant Christmas, Thanksgiving, Halloween, or all of the above, I had no idea. It was the last week of November, and the chill was really beginning to mount. I'd spent far longer than I wanted to in a desert, and the cold was honestly something I had looked forward to. Now, with my gloves, 2 pairs of socks, and a scarf draped over my face, I kinda missed the heat. The bookstore was on Main Street, not far from Lafferty's, and it had belonged to her parents before they gave it to Susan when she finished business school. Susan always loved books, and Wormwood Books was always dripping with paperbacks, hardcovers, and various older publications. I can remember Simon and I going there from time to time to look at newspaper articles for school projects. Mr. and Mrs. Brayman had a collection of old town papers and documents that rivaled the public library, and a lot of history buffs went in there to peruse the shelves. The bell jangled merrily overhead as I came in, and when Susan looked up to greet me, I saw her smile nearly take in her ears. Susan and I had always been close, even closer after my brother was taken, and I think she had hoped I might return home and pick up old habits again. As much as I would have liked that, I just didn't feel that I could do that to her. Knowing how my mission was likely to end, it felt like forcing her to lose me all over again. "Jeff," she said, leaning on the counter, "I was beginning to wonder if you were ever going to come and see me." "Well, I've been pretty busy in the woods. The forest just keeps getting closer and closer without us to cut it back." She nodded. "As it's always been, I'm afraid. What brings you in today? Clearly not just to see little old me." She smiled as she said it, but there was a note of sadness behind it I couldn't miss. "I'm, curious about the Foresters," I said, pitching my voice low. There weren't a lot of people in here, but I still didn't want to raise any suspicion. You know, since I have to work so close with them. "Hopefully not too close," she said, walking out from behind the counter and leading me into the back. The sales floor was for paperbacks and first editions. The back room was for the good stuff. The Brennans had spent their life collecting rare and important things, and it made them a lot of money from people looking to research different topics. Susan likely had historians and antiquity students coming and going, paying for the privilege to root through her back rooms. I could see shelves that sagged with old books on battles from hundreds of years ago, leather-bound tomes on horticulture and herbcraft, and lists of royal bloodlines. And that was just the books that I could see and read the titles of. The section she brought me to was full of ledgers from the town founders and the beginning of our oppression with the Foresters. "It would be easier if I knew what you were looking for," she hedged, pointing to an old desk beside a dusty shelf. "I'm just doing a little reading. They're interesting, right? We've lived with them for so long, and yet we don't really understand them." Susan scoffed. "Don't we? We know they make the fog. We know they snatch people who are out after dark. We know they take kids when they can..." But she stopped talking as she realized what she was saying. "I'm sorry, Jeff. I let my mouth get away from me. It's fine. People sometimes forget. We've all known someone who's lost someone to the Foresters." She nodded. I'll let you get to it. Remember, you have to wear the gloves if you touch the ledgers on the first or second shelf. They're in the top drawer." She left me to my devices, and I got started. Rayffered had been established in 1710. It was a logging town from the very start, but the loggers they sent into the woods came back with strange tales of creatures who took stragglers and seemed to bring demonic mists with them. Those who lit fires in the woods were never seen again, and the woods they cut back to build the town seemed to grow back at an unnatural rate. Many saw strange things at night, and residents quickly learned not to go out after dark. In 1720, one of the Rayffered magistrates claimed to have met one of the creatures, and he had given it the name Forester. One of his scribes had written his account down, since it was said that his honor was too shaken by the incident to hold a pen. He had been enjoying a pipe on the back porch of his home when a fog had suddenly rolled in, and one of the creatures had approached him. He had drawn his pistol expecting to be taken but wanting to go down fighting. But the creature had surprised him. Instead of taking him, it had spoken. The creature told me that it had come with a deal from the deep woods. The foresters would continue to make the trees grow into the settlement, something they had already been doing, and the people would be free to cut them back. He told the magistrate to keep his people out of the woods that surrounded the town, though they would be free to hunt outside the deep woods during the daylight hours. No one, under any circumstances, was to light a fire inside the woods at any time, he said, and on that the creature would not budge. The logging could continue, the town could continue, and there would be no need for anyone to encroach on anyone else. For a while, this seemed to work. The town lived by the rules, and those who didn't were never seen again. People who chose to homestead in the woods disappeared. Those who went into the woods after dark disappeared. Anyone who lit a fire in the woods disappeared. The logging went on through the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and it wasn't until the start of World War I that the treaty was broken. I was into the less crumbly ledgers by then, and found out that the mayor of 1915, Charles Magus, had decreed that the woods would again be cut. He was tired of living with superstition, and the town needed to grow. He organized contracts for several lumber companies and told them to cut as deep as they liked. When they started going missing, however, the old superstition seemed to become a little more real. 25 people went missing that first year, 10 the year after that, and 10 the year after that. If the foresters sent another emissary, it was ignored this time. The town grew, the forest continued to be cut back, and people kept going missing. That was when the rules were first established, and after that, fewer people went missing. The curfew went into place next year when the new mayor came into office. The town lived, though it lived in fear. Then came the bad night, the burning night. In 1938, the mayor decided he'd had enough of the foresters. Reginald Fox had campaigned on the grounds that he would do something about the forester problem, and boy had he. He went into the woods with a group of loggers and firemen and set the woods on fire. He claimed it was a controlled burn, something that would burn the woods away from the town, but instead of mist, it said that a black smoke buffeted the town. The foresters took 15 people in broad daylight, while the smoke covered everything, and none of the 60 men who'd gone into the woods were ever seen again. It was the largest loss to date, and the town had never set fire to the woods again. They had learned their lesson, it seemed, and it was a lesson they never forgot. Find what you're looking for? I jumped, catching the ledger as it started to fall, and looked up to find Susan smiling over me. Did I catch you doing something naughty? You didn't find any of Dad's old photo books Mom always accused him of having kept, did you? No, I said, nothing like that. Just doing a bit of research. On the foresters, she said. Not a question. Yeah, just doing some reading. Well, I hate to kick you out, but it's 5 o'clock and I need to close up before the sun goes down. Business hours are pretty bad during the winter. I looked at the little window near the ceiling, and sure enough, the sun was going down. I'd spent 5 hours back here poring over dusty tomes. Mom would be worried if I came running home right at dark again, like I'd done on Halloween, and I apologized for holding her up. No, any time. I won't pretend it isn't nice to have you hanging around. I felt a wiggly feeling in my guts, but I squashed it. I had a mission, and I couldn't lose sight of it. Would you mind if I came back next Saturday? I still want to do a little more reading. Of course. If you tell me what you're after, I can get some things out and make sure they're ready. I'll know them when I find them, but till then I'm just not sure. I put the ledgers away neatly and said my goodbyes, but when she called my name, I found myself brought up short. You know, you can tell me if you're doing something that maybe isn't wise. I won't judge you. I might even be able to help you. She looked so earnest as she locked eyes that I almost confessed my plans right there. Maybe she could help me. Maybe your dad could even help me. But I knew I couldn't bring her in on this. I wouldn't put her in any more danger than I had to. I wouldn't have another life on my conscience. I'll see you next week, I said, leaving out the front door before I could lose my resolve. Mark and I grew up together, meeting in nursery school when we were about 2. We played with the same toys, learned the same games, read the same books, and when we started school, we were both delighted to find that we were in the same class. I didn't really notice the chair at the foot of his bed until we were 6. We were playing Super Nintendo in Mark's room, being rambunctious and probably making a lot of noise. Our game of Mario Kart had turned into a little bit of horseplay, and when I bumped into the old wooden chair at the end of his bed, he jumped up like he'd been scalded. He picked it up, dusting the seat like it might be offended as he placed it carefully back where it had been. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to push your chair over." "That's okay. It's just got to sit there. It's kind of important." "Why is that?" I asked as he reached for his controller to go back to playing the game as if nothing had happened. "Oh, that's where my guardian angel sits at night." He said it in that way that made it very clear this was both something he believed in and was as normal to him as the toast he'd had for breakfast. When he noticed I hadn't picked up my controller to begin playing again, he looked back at me in confusion and seemed surprised by my look of stunned interest. "Your what?" "My guardian angel," he said. "What, you don't have one at the end of your bed every night?" I told him I didn't, and he seemed surprised. "Huh, Mom said everybody had them." He tried to go back to the game again, but I found myself much more interested in this guardian angel thing than our game of Mario Kart. As kids, you get used to hearing your playmates spout out about all kinds of odd things. Sometimes they don't really make sense. This, however, had been endorsed by a grown-up. To a kid barely into his 7th year, the word of an adult was still something I put a lot of stock into. If his mom had told him this, then it had to be true. And if a real angel sat at the end of his bed every night, then I wanted to know more about it, or even see it if I could. "Okay," he said, so when I was little, I woke up and found something at the foot of the bed that scared me. I thought it was a monster at first, but when I went and told my mom about it, she said it was my guardian angel. After that, we left a chair so that it could sit, since before it had just been standing at the foot of the bed. "And it comes every night?" "Every night. And now I'm not afraid of him, since I know that he's there to watch over me." The whole thing interested me greatly. Mark's family didn't strike me as particularly religious. I don't even think he went to church. So the idea of Mark having a guardian angel and not me was a little bit weird. If it was a real thing and Mark wasn't just pulling my leg, I wanted to see it too. That was when I started bothering Mark's mother, my mother, and Mark about having me over for a sleepover. We were getting to that age where sleepovers were pretty common, but it seemed like they just never had a good time to do it. There were always weekend plans. My parents were religious, so we always went to church on Sundays. I started trying for Friday night, or Saturday maybe, but there just always seemed to be something to stop us from spending the night at his house. As if in answer, Mark came to stay at my house a couple of times. That was fun, but it ultimately wasn't what I wanted. We couldn't see Mark's guardian angel at my house after all, so I kept asking and asking if I could stay the night, and finally we found a time that made it work. We were in 2nd grade, a whole 2 years after I started asking, when my parents suddenly needed to go out of town and didn't have a way to bring me with them. It was right in the middle of the school year, and they needed to go to a funeral from Thursday morning to Friday night. It wasn't really the sort of thing you could bring a kid to, and I suggested that maybe I could stay with Mark. My parents liked the idea. We had hosted Mark a few times, so his parents could have a date night or visit relatives, and so they called to see if it was something they could do. Mark's parents said they'd be happy to help, and I was filled with excitement as I packed my bag for a couple of days at Mark's house. Wednesday night was a blast. Mark's dad grilled hamburgers in the backyard while we played on the slip and slide. Mark's mom had rented a game from Blockbuster that we took turns playing. We watched some TV in the living room. His parents said we could stay up a little later than usual, and when his mother said it was time for us to get ready for bed, I felt excited all over again. As I lay on my pallet that night, sleeping in the shadow underneath Mark's bed, I was filled with anticipation as I watched the chair. I'd waited for years to see this, and I wasn't going to sleep until I saw it. The chair just sat there, a mute hunk of wood, and as the lights went out and Mark's last-minute chatter turned into soft snoring, I tried my best to stay awake. I wanted to see it, but as I began to yawn more frequently, I wasn't sure I'd make it. I wondered if Mark really had just been pulling my leg, and as the alarm clock on the nightstand went from 10:30 to 11, I thought it'd be a real joke if there never was an angel, and he'd just been having a laugh at me all these years. As my eyes grew heavy, I tried to keep awake until it got there. Inevitably, though, I lost the fight and fell asleep. I came awake suddenly in the unfamiliar darkness of Mark's bedroom. It was very early, and as I sat up with a start, I remember feeling that momentary sense of confusion. Where was I? What was going on? That was when I remembered that I was at a sleepover at Mark's, and why I was at a sleepover at Mark's. I glanced up at the chair, expecting to see something in white robes with wings and a halo. But I was disappointed in that respect. Disappointed, but utterly terrified. What I saw was a shapeless shadow with vaguely human proportions. The dimensions seemed to move when I watched it, though I don't think it had noticed me. It was leaning forward in the chair, staring at Mark like a hungry shark, and it didn't turn to look at me until I started screaming. It shifted its soupy face towards me, and I saw a pair of dancing red eyes amidst the miasma. It went right on looking at me until someone turned the lights on, and as the room came into view, the creature was just gone. Mark's mother was sympathetic, asking what had happened, and I lied and told her I just had a bad dream. She bought it, I think, but I think Mark knew what I had seen. He tried to ask me about it, but I rolled over and faced the wall as I pretended to go back to sleep. Mark tried again as his mom took us to school the next day, but I didn't want to talk about it. I was as terrified of what I had seen as I was disappointed at the outcome of my curiosity. My parents picked me up from school that day, having gotten back a little early, and I think they too sensed that something had happened. I slept more soundly in my own bed than I ever had before, and I never asked to sleep at Mark's house again. I may have never asked to spend the night at his house. But Mark and I remained good friends. I still went over to his house, I still hung out in his bedroom, but I never stayed after dark again. Incidentally, since the sleepover had been such a success, his mother let Mark stay over at our house more often. This seemed to work better for Mark's parents, too, and looking back, I don't think they got along well. They argued a lot, and many of the trips they took together ended abruptly without helping their marriage. When they divorced after Mark graduated high school, I think it was only really a surprise to Mark. They decided to sell the house and split the money, and Mark decided to move out on his own and start his adult life a little earlier than he had expected. So, when he asked if I wanted to be his roommate, it seemed like a no-brainer. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment near the college Mark was attending, and it was pretty cool. We got on about as well as 2 high school kids moving in for the first time together could. There were arguments about chores, loud parties that probably bothered the neighbors, late-night underage drinking sessions where we told each other all sorts of things, and plenty of general day-to-day life stuff. The things we had meshed well together in our new home, except for one thing he had brought from his old house that stirred up some memories I didn't want to think about. I was helping him move his things out of the back of his dad's F-150 when I caught sight of something that I hadn't thought about in years, though it had played quite often in my nightmares. Picking up a stack of boxes revealed a familiar wooden chair that had sat at the end of Mark's bed for as long as I could remember. It was the chair that the angel had sat in and watched him sleep. I asked him why he had brought it with him, and he looked at me like I was a fool. It's where my guardian angel sits. Duh. Why wouldn't I bring it? I had kind of hoped that the angel was just an at his house kind of thing, and the thought that it might be in our apartment at night gave me the creeps. My boss had been asking if I'd be interested in working the night shift for months, and after seeing that chair sat with such care at the end of his bed, I went and told my boss that I was ready to accept. I wanted to live with Mark and help him out, but I just couldn't stand being in that house at night. I could tell that Mark was a little miffed that I wouldn't be at home at night. Night was kind of the only time he wasn't at school or work, but he understood that the bills had to be paid. I don't think he actually understood why I'd taken the night shift. If I was off, I always kept my door locked and slept facing the wall. If the angel ever came into my room, I never knew about it. I certainly never left a chair at the foot of my bed, and I guess if it came to our house, it stayed in Mark's room. Though I guess in the end, it worked in Mark's favor. I was at work one night, playing on my phone and watching cameras, when my phone rang. I saw that it was Mark and figured he was just making sure I was going to be home in the morning before he had to go to school. When I picked up, however, he sounded frantic. Mark was yelling about needing me home right away and how he needed help calling the police. I told him to calm down and just go ahead and call the cops, but he said he couldn't until he cleaned up a little bit. Then he said the most chilling thing I'd heard since we were kids. The angel got him. Got who? I asked, still not sure what was going on. The intruder that broke into our house. I called my boss and told him about the situation, and he agreed to come work for me so that I could get things sorted out. I offered to come back, but he said there was no need. I was probably looking at police reports and other paperwork anyway, but to let him know if I wasn't going to be in tomorrow night so that he could make arrangements. He even said he'd pay me for the night. My boss was a good guy, one of the best bosses I've ever had, and I always appreciated how helpful he was. By the time I got home, Mark was in a tizzy. With good reason, too, since it looked like someone had exploded across his floor. There was blood on the walls, blood on the carpet, blood across the bedspread of Mark's bed, as well as hair, meat, and bones everywhere. The bones were splintered and broken, and everything looked like someone had been fed into a wood chipper. I didn't know what to make of it, but the most striking was the blood splashed across the plain wooden chair that sat placidly amidst the gore. I pulled Mark into the living room and asked him to tell me exactly what had happened. After a few glasses of water and a little scotch, he finally stopped shaking enough to tell me. He said he had heard the guy come in with a key, and he thought it was me. He had rolled over and went back to sleep, already seeing the angel there and feeling safe as he usually did. When he heard rustling in the living room, he thought it was a little odd, but figured I was just settling in for some gaming. When his bedroom door opened, he knew something was amiss. I didn't usually go into his room at night, especially not after what Mark considered bedtime, and the door opening made him turn to confront whoever it was. He had sat up in bed, looking at the person silhouetted in the hall light, and that's when he saw the angel turn its head to look at the intruder. "What the hell?" the guy said, his voice deep and confused. Mark said he had taken a step into the room, fiddling with something in his pocket, but he never got out what he intended to use. Suddenly the angel was standing, and Mark said it just sort of blurred at the guy. He knew how that sounded, but it was like one minute it was standing beside the chair, and the next they had been face to face in the doorway. He had reached out towards him, his hand sinking into the man's chest, and the intruder had made a noise like he was having indigestion. The angel simply pulled him to pieces. He had ripped him right down the middle, long ways, and that had been where most of the blood had come from. He had thrown him against the wall, well, half of him, and the other half he had dragged to the floor and began to eat. Mark said that that had been the worst part, watching it eat. It didn't eat like a normal creature. It ate by pressing its formless head against the body. Parts of the body just disappeared. It was like watching something that I couldn't see devour somebody. As it ate, Mark had gotten shakily out of bed and moved slowly around the perimeter of the room. He had watched the thing as he went, unsure whether it would hurt him or not, and when he came to the door, his hands trembled as he reached for the light switch. Just as the lights came on, the creature had looked up in surprise. Its eyes almost looked betrayed, and as he dissipated, Mark was left with the remains of its feast. I don't know what to do. The cops are never going to believe that some weird angel that I've had since I was a kid tore this guy apart. This is a little excessive, even for a home invader, and I'm afraid that I'm going to be in trouble. It's probably going to incriminate both of us for me to put this in here, but we came up with a story that wouldn't sound quite so crazy. The story was that Mark had been in the bathroom when the guy came in. Mark had locked the door and hunkered down to wait on them while they started taking things. While hiding, Mark heard something going on in the bedroom, and when everything had gone quiet, he came out to find the guy like that. It was a shaky story. The cops were likely to raise an eyebrow at it, but Mark isn't a very big guy, and the idea that he might have hidden instead of trying to confront a home invader isn't too far-fetched. No more far-fetched than the idea that he could rip a guy in half. So we called the cops, and after answering some questions and a trip to the station for some more questions, we were put up in a hotel for the night while they checked out our apartment. It turned out that the guy who had come in to rob us was the landlord's nephew. We've had several apartments that had been broken into without much sign of a break-in, and the cops finally had their answer. The nephew has been using the keys from the main office to go into people's houses, and he usually chooses places where no one was likely to be home. I'd met the nephew on the on-site gym a few times, and he knew I worked nights and likely thought my apartment would be empty, not realizing I had a roommate. They found a lot of evidence at the nephew's apartment, an apartment owned by his uncle too, so the case seemed pretty open and shut. Most of them thought that he'd had an accomplice who was on drugs or something, and the two had just gotten into a brutal exchange over some of the plunder. We actually got a small reward for calling it in, though I think our landlord had mixed feelings about the whole incident. Mark threw the chair out after that. He just didn't feel safe with it at the end of his bed anymore. The angel had been his guardian, and it had protected him, though maybe a little overzealously. It's unclear whether Mark would still be alive if it hadn't been there, but it seemed that, like me, Mark had seen more than he was comfortable with when he'd seen it attack the guy. He put the chair by the dumpster, and somebody must have taken it because it was gone by the next day. I don't know if the angel still comes back to the foot of his bed or not, but if it does, I guess it's standing these days. There's a legend in my town that has always stuck with me, and it's something we grow up hearing since we're very small. Tommy Coldtoes is as much a part of our lives as things like Soap Sally and the Wampus Cat. It's a story that our parents used to scare us into behaving. It's always the same thing, said in those tones of knowledge that make you believe it's true. Better get to bed on time, or Tommy Coldtoes might decide to crawl into your bed. You better not get up to mischief, or Tommy Coldtoes will find his way into your bed. Don't you dare lie to your mother, or Tommy Coldtoes will let her know. The story it comes from is even more chilling than the thought of a ghost in your bed. It's a story about how even a town with less than 1,000 people can host a murderer. Our town was founded in 1789 by a handful of settlers. By 1819, they had either befriended or conquered the Indians that lived in the area, and their daily struggles were mostly personal. The town had around 300 residents, give or take, and one winter they had a problem with a lake in the area. Mather's Lake was a common place to find picnickers or fishermen, but this winter it became the dumping ground for a serial killer. The accounts say that the sheriff was called to the lake one morning at first light to assess a body. A fisherman by the name of Jeremy Gooding had come before dawn to cut a hole for some ice fishing. As the sun rose, however, he felt like someone was watching him. When he looked down to find a body looking up at him through the ice, he said he nearly had a heart attack. The man had gone in his wagon and driven back to town to get the sheriff, and the sheriff had brought a few men with him with saws to break through the ice. With the help of the fishermen, they had pulled out the body of Gilbert Campbell. Gilbert was a farmer from the area and a notorious sot. He wasn't a very good farmer, and it was well known that he had too many mouths to feed and not enough money to afford his drinking and his children. The general consensus was that he'd been walking across the ice on his way home from town and had fallen through and drowned. He couldn't swim, this was widely known, and he was likely too drunk to properly flounder to the surface. His wife and children mourned him, but it was all chalked up to an accident, and life went on. When Gooding went to the same lake 2 weeks later and found 2 more bodies floating beneath the crust of ice, it was harder to push it off as an accident. The victims, Delbert Moore and Winston Fergan, were from the town, though Delbert was a day laborer and Winston was a blacksmith's apprentice. While Gilbert's route home would have taken him across the lake, there was no reason why either of these men should have been in the area. Delbert worked for a farm on the other side of town, and Winston lived above the blacksmith. The sheriff refused to entertain the idea that these could be anything but accidents, but when the 4th body came out of the lake, he had to admit that they might have a problem. The 4th was Harvey McMillan, the son of Drake McMillan, who owned the local bank, and Drake was mad to catch the man who had killed his son. As Mr. McMillan leaned on the sheriff to get results, the sheriff began to apply more pressure to people of interest. There were patrols set up around the lake, and the other local fishing holes were checked for signs of bodies. That was when they discovered 4 more bodies, all farmhands or laborers, and a pattern began to become apparent. All of them were immigrants, except for Harvey. Harvey was born in town, but he'd taken his accent from his father, and the sheriff supposed that's why he had been targeted. It appeared they had a problem on their hands, and it was a problem that the sheriff was very interested in solving. The local sheriff was supposed to keep the peace, and if he couldn't protect the people from whoever was dropping them into the frozen lakes, then they would find someone who could. The town had instituted a watch, keeping citizens on the street to a minimum after dark. They had to assume that these deaths were the result of people being coerced away after dark, and if they could limit the killer's potential victims, then they could catch him in the act. They suspected Jeremy Gooding for a time, but the boy's alibi was strong. There was a rumor going around that a strange woman might be responsible, luring men away from the tavern so she could hide her crimes beneath the ice. They picked up a few women who frequented the local watering holes, but they were released in short order. For a time, the town lived in fear of who would be the next body pulled out of the icy lake. Then, just as December began, they found the body of Thomas Graves. Thomas, Tommy to his friends, was new in town, but well known by those who frequented the tavern. He was a laborer, but his exploits were known to lie at the bottom of a tankard. Tommy could drink any man in town under the table, and his thirst was as prodigious as he was. What's more, he wasn't prone to anger or the hooligan behaviors of his peers. He was a sociable drunk, a cheery sot, and everyone knew that he could drink a keg and still be awake to do the milking at first light. So when the sheriff was called to Carter's Pond at dusk to collect him, it was considered a shame by all. He had sent a pair of constables out to collect him in a wagon, and as they pulled him from the lake, They say his skin was as blue as the ice atop it. They checked his pulse and found him stone cold dead, so they loaded him into a wagon and took him into town. This was December, so the snow was deep and the road was pitted. They had a sheet over him as he lay in his funeral wagon, and the men shivered as they rode with only the moon to keep them company. Both were in some hurry to be done with this task, so they could get to the tavern themselves before heading home to their wives. The grim task would be easier to sleep on after a drink was inside them, and neither were paying as much attention to the body in the back as they should have. The body bounced like a stone as they rode, and neither of them could have said when that bouncing stopped. When they arrived in the town and pulled the sheet away, they found the back of the wagon empty. They had lost the body somewhere along the way, and when they told the sheriff, he was livid. He told them the town already believed that they were making a botch of this, and made them go back the way they had come to look for it. It should be easy to find, he told them. It's a frozen body lying by the side of the road. The two men set out to backtrack their route, but no matter how much they looked or how far they went, they couldn't find the frozen body. They found no sign either. There was no indent in the snow, no sign of scavengers taking something away, and they were left to wonder where it had gone. They searched till morning, spending a night in the cold as they looked for their missing victim. They were still searching when the sun came up, and when they heard hoofbeats approaching, they were hoping it was others who would help them look. Instead, the sheriff came riding up with another man in tow to collect them. The body had been found, and it was in the last place they would have expected. Judge Henry Margus, a judge for the county seat, had awoken to find the body of Thomas Graves in his bed. His servants had heard him screaming and come to check on him, finding him in the corner as he shook and pointed at the bed that he had evacuated. They said that he had been gibbering about rolling over and feeling the cold feet of the dead man against his leg, and wouldn't say much else. He had been shaking as his butler took him off to the sitting room. That same butler, the man who had come out with the sheriff, had secured the bedroom so that they might have a look and come to fetch him immediately. He and his men took statements from the staff and the very shaken judge, but it was ultimately nothing but a strange bit of gossip for the women around the well that day. They took the body to the station so the family could come collect it, and that was when it disappeared a second time. The sheriff, who had reprimanded the two deputies soundly for losing the body in the first place, was perplexed how Thomas Graves had disappeared a second time. He was less perplexed when the judge's footman arrived in the morning to say that Thomas Graves had appeared in his master's bed again. The sheriff arrived to find the man shaken, unable to even speak, but he stuttered about the cold toes of the dead man that had pressed against him as he slept. They took the body away and decided it might be time to bury Tommy Graves so he would stop haunting the judge's house. He would have no idea how fitting a statement that would turn out to be. They buried Thomas Graves in a pauper's grave in the churchyard and thought that they had seen the end of him. They had considered leaving him in the crypt in case his family decided to come for him, but the sheriff was becoming tired of whoever was using Thomas to bedevil the judge. The man hadn't been to court in days, and it was said that the incident had rattled him. The sheriff watched as the undertaker and his apprentice buried Thomas Graves 8 feet in the ground, and hoped that this would be the end of the trouble. It hadn't gone unnoticed that there hadn't been another body found since they had pulled him from the ice, and some of the townspeople were whispering that Graves might have been the killer. Now his body was haunting the judge after death, and somehow that seemed to make it more believable that he was the one putting people in the ice. They had begged the sheriff to put a cage over top his grave, maybe even burn the body, but the sheriff was steadfast in his conviction that Tommy be buried. No servant came on the third day. On the third cold morning after Thomas had come out of the ice, the judge came bursting into the station to confess to murder. He confessed to the murders of all those pulled from the ice, including Tommy Graves. The sheriff's hunch had been right, it seemed, and he confessed to killing all of them because they were immigrants. He had never liked foreigners and assumed that no one would notice if a few of them went missing. He had assumed that someone would catch him after killing Harvey McMillan, but when he had walked away scot-free, he felt invincible. That was before, though. Now he was being hounded by the vengeful Thomas Graves and wanted the sheriff to protect him. I would have never killed him if I had known he would haunt me so. The sheriff knew they would find Tommy in the man's bed again, and that's just where he was when they went to collect him. It seemed, however, that Tommy wasn't content to stay put. They never found him in the judge's house again, but there were plenty of people who claimed to have seen him after that. Usually it was a shadowy figure walking along the road to town, the same route the wagon had taken when he had disappeared. Others say they've seen him near the lake, where he died, walking along the shore and watching the water. Others, however, claim that those with secrets, those with guilt, feel the press of cold toes against their leg in the night and know it's time to confess. I've never felt them, but I know people who claim they have, and that's as good as a confession around here. Whatever the reason, Tommy Cold Toes has become a story told from Halloween till Christmas in these parts. So if you roll over in the middle of the night and feel the cold press of toes against your leg, don't worry. It's just Tommy Cold Toes trying to get warm. Hey guys, it's been a little bit since I've updated, maybe, and I figured I'd let you guys know what's been going on. Gale has taken me under his wing and is showing me his secrets to surviving in here. He's a good teacher, and I'm learning some tricks for navigating the DGBs. It's hard to explain it all, but I'm going to try my best. A lot of it's mental preparation and association, which is really hard to teach, but Gale's a pretty good teacher, and I'm starting to get the hang of it. The first lesson was how the DGBs work. All the Dollar Generals are like spokes on a big tire. They all move forward, never backward. You can't go back simply by going through the door. Wherever you entered from is your first spoke on the wheel. That's why everyone's journey starts in a different place. My first spoke is different from yours, and my last spoke will be different from yours too. There are nearly infinite Dollar Generals. At least I've never seen one repeat itself by going through the door. I'm sure there must be an end to them, but I'm not sure I want to see what it looks like any more than you do. You with me so far? I nodded, but thinking about it made my head hurt a little bit. Traveling the spokes, the stores, is easy. You just go through the door. Navigating the stores, that's a little harder. The way I did it was to think of the stores as spokes on a wheel, but a wheel needs a hub. This store is my hub. It's the middle point where I come to get out of the wheel. Technically, I guess it's a spoke too, but thinking of it as a hub helps ground myself. You get it? I waffled a little, not wanting to admit it was a little over my head. Kinda? Kale laughed. Don't worry, you'll pick it up. It's like riding a bike. Once you do it, it's easy. In that, he wasn't wrong. Lesson number 2 was traveling with people. So if you're traveling with other people, you have to be touching them for the two of you to travel together. Here, put a hand on my shoulder, he said, as he prepared to step through the door. I slid a hand on his shoulder, and we stepped through together, into a similar store. This one, however, was KK, the place I'd found Gale's bulletin board. See, that's how we came out into my Dollar General, when we left the miasma behind. I had a hand on your back, so we could travel together. That made sense, and we proceeded with Lesson 3, traveling to a specific place. You've done yourself a favor by leaving marks behind. At first, I was popping around to stores I remembered, like the ones with the weird letters or the ones with the strange things in them. But once I started leaving my own markings, I could travel to specific places. Pick out one of the stores you've been to before, and let's go there. He put a hand on my shoulder, and when I walked through the door, we came out in LL instead of GG, the store with the Mother's Day decorations. I was a little disappointed, but Gail patted my shoulder reassuringly. It's tricky. Took me a while to figure it out, too. Let's try again. Picture the marks you left. Close your eyes, get a good mental picture, and then step through the door. I tried again, really focusing on the twin G's, but when I stepped through this time, it was to find myself in an older location, the one with a single G on the floor. When I told him I'd goofed again, however, he told me it was progress. You're getting the hang of it. Going to G when you were thinking about GG is pretty damn close. Just keep practicing. You'll get it. We spent a while just traveling from one store to the next. Sometimes I got close. Sometimes I just moved forward. But after a while, I started to travel to the right destinations sometimes. It was something that took a lot of focus, and when I put my hand to my head and told him I was getting a headache, Gail suggested that we take a little break. Have a rest, drink some water or some Gatorade or maybe some coffee. Just kind of take it easy for a bit. It isn't something you get right away. It takes practice, and even I sometimes get it wrong after all this time. I can't say how long we were at it, but for what must have been a few days, we worked on pinpointing my navigation to the stores that I had been to already. I saw a lot of familiar places, though Gail refused to go to the meat market store, as he called it. He said that he'd encountered shadows there, shadows that thought he might be for sale, and he had barely escaped with his life. I figured I must have gone while they were closed, and counted myself lucky. After a while, I could travel pretty well between stores without too much trouble, and when Gail was pretty confident that I had the process down, he suggested we move on to something else. Lesson 4 involved bringing other things with you to other stores. So your clothes travel with you because you don't think about them coming with you. It's like your nose or your hands. They're parts of you, and your mind just assumes that they'll make the trip. Now, I want you to take a good look at yourself and visualize what you look like in your clothes. Once you have it committed to memory, then you can add things to it and take them with you. He made me practice in front of a full-length mirror, inspecting myself and committing my clothes to memory. The clothes weren't hard. I'd worked at the same place for years and was very aware of what my uniform looked like. No, the hard part was adding to it. I found the most colorful backpack in the store, but committing it to memory was difficult. If it wasn't just right, then it wouldn't come with me, and Gail assured me that the backpack was all I needed to get right. Once you get the backpack down, everything you zip inside is inside. You don't really have to remember it, because it's inside the bag, and you know it's inside the bag. Once you have the bag down, the rest is cake. That one took a while and gave me some headaches. Sometimes the bag wouldn't come with me. Sometimes the bag would, but I would concentrate so hard on the bag that I wouldn't travel where I wanted to go. Sometimes I'd load it up with stuff and find that the bag stayed in the place where I had been, and not where I'd went to. Gail told me to be diligent, and after a while, it all came together. I couldn't say how long that was, but it had to be about a month. We went about my training the same way I had gone about traveling. When I was tired, I slept. When I was hungry, I ate, and when I had to go, I went. Gail had an answer for solid waste too, and it made me laugh when he explained it. The place with the burnt roof is where I take all my crap to. I figure if it's where that thing moves around the most, he's welcome to it. We went there when we had a bunch of it, Gail putting it in hefty bags and sealing it in his backpack. He tossed it into the gaping ceiling and ran, the two of us coming back to the DGB-0 like kids after a prank. Gale said he always waited till he had a whole bag to throw it out, and he hoped the creep liked the little present. Gale and I became good friends, but I think it was more than that for him. Sometimes when he clapped me on the shoulder, there was an almost parental gleam in his eye. We ate together, we slept near each other, we talked a lot, we became close quickly. He talked about his travels, the things that he had seen in more than 20 years that he'd been moving through the Dollar Generals, but eventually we landed on a topic that I was hoping he knew something about. "How far in have you been?" I asked one night, as we were cooking marshmallows over a propane burner. Gale thought about it as he slid the mess between graham crackers and chocolate. "I've marked up to 218, I think. Do you..." I thought about my question a little more as I chewed over my own s'more. "Do you think anyone's made it out?" I said, slurping a little as the treat stuck to my mouth. "I don't know," he said. "If they did, I don't suppose we'd know. Not unless they left notes." I nodded, taking a sip of lukewarm cola to clear the roof of my mouth. Surely the store can't go on forever. There has to be an end. Gale shrugged. "I suppose. Wouldn't make sense for them to go on that long. I almost hope there isn't, though. If there is an end, then there's only so much food, water, and supplies. We'll eventually starve to death here, and that's a bleak prospect." We went to bed not long after, but I never stopped thinking about the infinite loop of perfectly odd Dollar General stores. What would be at the end if there was one? Would it be an exit? Would there be a creature living there? Was the end what lay outside or in the ceiling? I had no answer, so I drifted off, thinking about the possibilities as the fluorescents hummed overhead. Gale and I started exploring more after that, and I think he was looking for other people to add to our group. "We could go see if the hermit wants to join our band," I asked, and Gale laughed bitterly as he pointed to his stomach. "Maybe give him a chance to finish what he started, too." I wasn't surprised to hear that the hermit had been the one to stab him, but I did wonder why he never traveled. We never saw him while we were out getting things, and we avoided his little corner like the plague. FF was strictly off limits, and now I realized I had gotten off very lucky in our exchange. I don't know how long I spent with Gale, but it felt like years. I know I say that a lot, but it's hard to convey how strange time is on this side. Time is something I'm used to counting, used to hoarding like a dragon, but here it isn't something I have to think about. What's more, I don't know if anyone is even getting these updates. If they are, how quickly or slowly are they getting them? Are they coming in daily? Weekly? Are you waiting years between messages? Are your children seeing them and having vague memories of something their parents told them when they were small? Are all the Dollar General beyond, or otherwise, stones beneath the foundation of some other store? Does the name mean anything to those who may or may not be reading it? I don't know. I write these updates because it feels right. I write them because I feel like I should. I've gotten pretty good at traveling now. I can travel back and forth, carry supplies, hold things in my hand and travel, change my clothes and bring them back with me, and it makes me proud and a little afraid. With two of us, Gale and I have used some of the dolly loaders to move shelves around in our hub. We're opening up the floor plan, and now we have all this space for activities. I know, cheesy, but it's a classic. I've started keeping a journal of the different Dollar General Beyonds, so I can remember which ones are which. Here's a few of my favorites. Store FF, designation dangerous. Food, none. People, 1. The theme is destroyed. It's the home of the crazy hermit. Beware this store. The shelves are bare of food. The hermit has hoarded it all somewhere safe. Could be secrets here, but they're hard to find. Store JJJ, designation dangerous. Food, minimal. People, none. Theme is waste disposal. Where we drop our waste. A fire took out most of the store a long time ago. The food here is all non-perishable and it's stacked up in the back. Known location where the miasma come out. Store T. Designation low to moderate dangerous. Food, plentiful but strange. People, none. Shadow creatures a possibility. Theme, strange human meat market. This is the place that may contain shadow creatures. The shelves contain what appears to be human meat, and the store smells like coppery plastic. My research partner claims to have been accosted by these creatures, so proceed with caution. Stuff like that. I'm working on a more complete study of them, now that I can take my notes and things with me without putting them on my phone, which will run out of space eventually, and I'm hoping to make a complete study of the DGBs. That's all for now. I'll shoot you an update when I have more. Sitting here writing this out, listening to Gale snore, it's nice to have someone to talk to and just be with. I hope it's something that will last. My friends and I like to take what we call an adventure weekend about 3 times a year. We met in college while we were brothers in Pi Beta Kappa. There's Jared, Max, and Raj, and me, of course. PBC is a forever kind of brotherhood, but we took it a little more seriously than most. We all live in different parts of the United States, but 3 times a year, we come together for these 3 to 5 day trips that are just epic. We've gone ziplining in Costa Rica, mountain climbing in the Rockies, whitewater rafting in Mexico, and diving in the Bahamas. We've been all over the world, and though it may seem a little excessive, so what? We're 4 unmarried guys with no kids and great jobs, so our income is still pretty much ours to blow as we see fit. So when Max said we should get a houseboat and go trolling up the coast for 5 days, we were all on board, pun definitely intended. So we met at a little port in Mississippi as he introduced us to the Trawler Queen. She was a 2-cabin houseboat with a living room, a party deck, 2 monster motors, and a galley with enough beer and snacks to keep the party going for 7 days and 6 nights. We were stoked to say the least, and as Max pulled us out of the marina, we knew this was going to be an adventure for the books. That statement would prove to be a little too prophetic. I haven't really properly introduced the guys yet, and it's important that you get the group dynamic down. Me and Jared were the jocks of the group, a pair of gym rats who were constantly on the grind for the perfect physique. Max was our resident cool guy, just a chill dude who liked to party and usually organized our little adventures. Raj was our brain, and most of us probably wouldn't have graduated without him. He was probably the smartest guy in the frat, and he'd helped a lot of us keep our GPAs up so we could keep our various grants and scholarships. We all had our parts to play, like the A-team, and each of us made up for some shortcoming in the group. Max had charted our course so that we could stop sometimes and spend our nights partying in different ports. Biloxi, Long Beach. Finally, we'd end up in New Orleans, where we'd turn the boat into the rental company and get a car back to our original dock so we could get our cars. It was a good plan, but Raj pointed out that his route took us through several large shipping lanes that would likely bring us close to larger shipping vessels, which, were the ones that used them. They'd probably capsize us if we got too close. Might be better to stick to the less busy waterways if we expect to get the deposit back on our rented houseboat. Max brushed it off. If we take these routes, we're better suited to stop in the party ports. Come on, Raj, live a little. Raj furrowed his brow, but he didn't argue. Roger McCormick, an underprofessor at the college that we graduated half a decade ago, might not be a risk taker, but Raj had learned long ago to roll with the punches when it came with us. It usually came out okay, and Raj enjoyed the adventure as much as the rest of us. We had been out about 3 days, preparing to stop in Gulfport and take on provisions before heading to New Orleans, when we saw something strange in the water. Well, not that strange, I guess. After all, it's not really uncommon to see a rubber duck in the water. It's kind of where they hang. Most of the time it's bathtubs or sinks, though, and not off the coast of Louisiana. I was manning the wheel, playing captain while Max went and took a break, and when I first saw it, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. I wouldn't have seen it at all if it wasn't fluorescent orange and riding a huge wave. It was just one at first, a single little guy bobbing on the waves and smiling happily, but as I watched, I saw more of them come up on a swell. They were ducks. Some of them with sunglasses, ducks with scarves, holiday ducks, ducks in all colors, and as they floated past, I laughed, thinking it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. "Hey, guys," I called down to the others who were playing cards in the galley. "Come check this out." Max popped up first, as if he expected trouble. When he saw our little escort of colorful plastic borders, however, he laughed too. It was hard not to. The sight of all those ducks bobbing on the surface was just so weird. It was almost a little too weird. What were these ducks doing out here anyway? The longer I watched them bobbing around, the more it made me kind of nervous as well. Where'd they all come from? Why were they suddenly all around us? It was easy to laugh at them if you didn't ask questions, but hard not to feel creeped out when you stopped to think about why they were here. "Why are there so many ducks out here?" asked Jared, watching them flow around the ship as they roiled in the dark water. "Well, it could be that they're testing ocean currents and swell patterns." Max had taken the wheel again, a large wave splashing against the bow and sending a few of the ducks onto the deck. He gave Raj a weird look, though. "What?" "Ocean current patterns. Sometimes oceanography institutes will release a bunch of rubber ducks and watch wave patterns and changes in tidal flow. They've got little trackers in them so they can plot their course, which helps them decipher currents and stuff." Jared picked up one of the ducks and squeezed it, eliciting a friendly squeak from the smiling toy. "Seems like it'd be bad for the environment. Wouldn't it lead to all kinds of environmental problems?" Raj furrowed his brow as Jared squeaked it again before tossing it into the water. He started picking them up and throwing them into the black soup, a few of them skipping across the surface before disappearing into the night. I realized we'd been a little farther from the coast than Max had meant for us to be, though I could still see it. The lights were far away and ethereal. "That is weird. The ones they usually use are made out of cork or something biodegradable. Even if they're rubber, they usually don't squeak." We watched them come rolling in as the waves got progressively higher. Something was stirring up the water not too far from us, and Max seemed to be steering us towards it. When I mentioned this, he said he just wanted to see what it was. His curiosity piqued. Might be a ship in distress or something. Maybe we could help him. He had some idea of being a big hero or something, but I wasn't sure that we could do anything if it was a big transport ship. They'd have a lot more people than our little boat could hold. A boat that sometimes felt a little full with 4 people on board. We cruised between a pair of buoys, heading into open water as we looked for the source of the turbulent water and the ducks. The rope color made it pretty clear that the area was dotted with reefs and sandbars, and the little islands that dotted the area made it even clearer that caution was required out here. It'd be real easy to come up on a sandbar and scrape our hull, or blow our bottom out on a reef, and then we'd be floating on driftwood all the way to the rental agency to explain how we'd taken our boat somewhere unadvisable. We came up with a little inlet, the GPS telling us we were entering a major transport lane, and that was when we found the source of the ducks. Their transport ship had been massive, likely hauling all sorts of things. Most of it was sinking to the bottom of the ocean. The ship was in the process of joining its cargo, and as it capsized, it was sending up massive waves and tidal surges. The ducks were coming out of a container that had broken open, and as it slipped beneath the water, it spewed out the floating little knickknacks as they scattered on the surface, pushed by the waves. That should have been the scariest part, the sinking ship, but it couldn't hold a candle to the massive tentacles that were wrapping around the hull and dragging it under. They were hard to make out in the dark of the night, but their undersides were cream-colored and covered in suction cups. They were massive, rising into the air as they came slithering from the depths of the ocean. Even from our position, over 100 feet away, I didn't think any of us felt safe. We were on this creature's turf, bobbing on the surface of its hunting ground, and if it wanted us, there was nothing we could do about it. "We need to go," Raj whispered, as if he was afraid the thing could hear him. "We need to go while it's still mangling that ship." Max agreed, and as we pulled away as quietly as we could, the rest of us kept a close eye on those rising tentacles as they descended into the ocean with the remains of the cargo ship. As we came slowly through the reefs and the bars, we kept expecting to feel a tentacle latch around us and drag us down. The ducks just kept coming, the waves of colorful toys no longer as whimsical as they had been. We had been planning to anchor for the night around midnight, but when I sat up out of a stupor the next day and discovered we were pulling into New Orleans, it wasn't a surprise. None of us had said as much, but I think we were all feeling a little less than safe out here after what we'd seen the night before. The rental company told us they couldn't give us a refund for the days we hadn't used, but we told them that was fine. I didn't feel safe until my feet were on solid ground again, and I've never been happier to live in a landlocked state. We had fun with the rest of our trip, exploring the Big Easy and taking in the sights and smells of the city, and after a few nights of leisure, we started to wonder if it had all really happened. Maybe we'd just gotten spooked by all those rubber ducks after having a little too much to drink. Maybe we had a group hallucination. Maybe we just seen something shadowy out in the ocean and jumped to conclusions. 2 nights later, though, while drinking in a little hole-in-the-wall bar, we discovered that it hadn't been just drunken delusions. We were all laughing after our 3rd or 4th pitcher of beer when Raj suddenly sat up a little straighter and looked at one of the TVs behind the bar. He went over to it, asking the barman to turn it up, and as we followed behind him, we caught the tail end of a news report about a ship that had recently gone missing on its way to New Orleans. The story had a picture of a large cargo ship, a ship that we had all watched get drug into the water a few nights ago. And the news lady was talking about how it was a huge mystery for local sailors. The ship, nearly 100% automated except for a crew of 10, was lost at sea somewhere off the coast of Louisiana. While several cargo containers have been found off the coast as well, the ship itself has seemingly vanished. Residents in the area have been inundated with rubber ducks for the last few nights, and there's concern that the ship may have sunk and been pulled out by an errant current. They showed the footage of a massive amount of rubber ducks washing up on the beach near Long Beach. Watching those ducks go in and out with the waves made me anxious in a way I couldn't explain, but didn't need to. It was pretty clear that everyone here was feeling the same, and when the newscaster moved on to another story, we ordered another pitcher and returned to our table. The festivities were definitely a little muted after that, and it was decided that boating was right out for our future trips. I think maybe we'll go to Vegas next year. Vegas sounds nice, especially after what we saw. Pamela Winters had dressed modestly for her first excursion into Stragview. The warden had a very specific task in mind, and he had promised her double her usual rate if she could get results. She presented her credentials at the gate, and after a trip through the metal detector and a thorough search of her belongings, she was told to proceed to the warden's office. She doubted that visitors were usually allowed to bring in implements for brewing tea, but her brother had likely given them special orders to let her through with whatever she needed to get his information. She had chosen She had chosen one of her more modest pantsuits, and she was still aware of the eyes on her as she passed the orderlies working in the hallway. She imagined that most of them hadn't seen anyone like her in a while, but the attention was less than flattering. She didn't have to guess which door was his. It was printed in large, gaudy letters across the front of the pebbled glass window. He had always had a flair for dramatic presentation, and his current form was far from low profile. She imagined that the warden of Stragview played a part in many of the inmates' nightmares. She knocked and was told to enter, the man in the pinstripe suit looking smugly over the top of his cup as he drank. She made a face as the smell of Earl Grey hit her in full. When it came to tea, it seemed he had less refined tastes. "So nice of you to finally join us," he said, smiling at her through the steam of his cup. "We can't all work through the holidays like you, dear brother." He cocked a leg on his knee, studying her through the rising condensation that had turned his glasses steamy. "Sorry, prisons never close. Holidays are just another day for us. I trust you've been having fun in your little den amongst the sheep." "Pleasantries were never your strong suit," Pamela said as she took a seat across from him. "Let's get down to business. What do you want?" The warden shook his head and tutted a little. "You've lived in the shadow of my prison for so many years, and yet you never came to say hello or have a chat with me. Some people might think you were trying to avoid me." "Smart people would," Winter said icily. "Now what do you want?" The warden sat back, still wearing that Cheshire Cat's grin as he sipped his tea. "I have a problem. A problem I seem incapable of brute-forcing my way through." "Subtlety was ever your speed, though I imagine it's easier to find brutes in a place like this," Winter quipped, taking a species of smug satisfaction from his need to ask for help. The warden, however, chose to ignore her attempts at needling him. "There is an object of power loose in my prison. Well, there are several, actually, but this one is the most troubling at the moment." "And why is that?" "Oh, some capricious god has decided to mess with me, very likely. Happens more than you would—" No, I mean, why is this one more dangerous than the others?" At that, her brother seemed uncomfortable. "That's not relevant to your questions," the warden said, a little too quickly for Winter's liking. "Am I at least allowed to know what it is that I'm looking for?" The warden seemed to give this some serious thought before agreeing to some breadcrumbs. "It's a small stone idol. That's all you need to know." Winter wanted to tell him that that was far from all she needed to know, but decided to leave it at that. Her brother was not his usual self, and that spoke volumes about this thing he was looking for. He was fidgety and unsure of himself in a way that he was trying very hard to hide. Winter hadn't seen him in close to 1,000 years, and this was the first time that she had seen him like this. Her brother was never the type to rely on brute force, and generally relied on plans within plans. In that respect, he was more like their father, and that sort of intrigue was ultimately the reason that she had left home. He had changed very little in that respect, and it ultimately reminded her that, at the end of the day, all he sought was their father's acceptance, something he was unlikely to ever find. "Do you have a place where I can set up?" As it happened, he did. Winter settled herself in a little room where inmates met with their attorneys, and he sent one of his guards, Ingram by the stitching on his shirt, to go retrieve the inmate in question. As he stood in the doorway, fidgeting and walking around nervously, she brewed her tea and made herself comfortable. As the smell of winter cherry and ginseng cascaded over him, he smirked, also picking up the baser elements and understanding the nature of the brew. Just like our mother, you always believed that the answers could be found in the stomach. And just like our father, you always believed that you could find what you lack in intrigue, rather than honest discussion. That shut him up, and she was glad. He had always been a nasty know-it-all who was never content to know less than those around him. As the man came in a few minutes later, Winter could tell that he'd been touched by something dark. He looked as if he had aged rapidly, shrinking to nearly a toddler's size. His skin hung on him like an old man, and his eyes were dull and listless. She wasn't going to get much out of this one. Not from his mouth, anyway. She was going to have to go in and take the knowledge that she needed. Something she hated to do. "What's his name?" The warden looked surprised. "What? His name? What is his name?" He looked at the guard who had brought the man in, and Ingram gravelled out that the man's name was Dryer. "Very well, Mr. Dryer, I'm going to help you get some of that out of your head. Just relax. I'm not going to hurt you. It's best if you drink a little of this," she said as she pressed the cup to his lips. "Lean forward and let me work." Without a word, the man did lean forward and sipped from the offered cup. It was as if he was eager to have whatever was in his mind out too. Winter reached forward, placing her hands on his head, and let her fingertips sink into the bald, flaky scalp. Officer Ingram gasped as her fingers slipped through the skin, reaching for the mace on his belt with a shaky hand. "Warden, she can't," the guard started, but the warden told him to go have a smoke break, and he would call him when they needed him. As the door closed, the warden rolled his hand lazily at her, indicating her to proceed. Winter nodded, closing her eyes as she got to work. He had found it on the rec yard. Some inmates like to exercise during rec. Some of them like to play sports. Some of them just like to walk around and enjoy the fresh air. Nathan Dryer liked to dig. He had liked to dig since he was a child, and it was something that followed him into adulthood. He had gone from building sandcastles and little construction sites to digging holes to inspect bugs or things he found with his metal detector. His metal detector was actually what had brought him here in the first place, and when he had been found digging up bullet fragments on federal property, they had arrested him and hit him with 5 years for trespassing. Nathan was just trying to do his time so he could get back to the real world, but Stragview was about to impose itself on him in a way that he could never expect. Nathan had learned pretty quickly not to dig very deep. As Yard Sergeant Bailey had informed him, he was doing something that could be seen as an escape attempt. So Nathan never dug very deep, and he was always careful never to dig near the fence. He was also careful to fill in his holes when he was done. That way the people playing sports didn't trip in them. Neither would the guards doing a rec yard check later that night, which would almost be worse. The last thing he wanted was an additional charge for assaulting staff by having them trip in one of his holes. So, there he was, digging around near the north side of the walking track as he looked for bugs and worms, and just marveling at the wet red clay that he found there. He had been told that this was where they started the mines that were supposed to lay under Stragview, but he had never seen them. No one to his knowledge had ever seen the mines. They had been closed in the 60s after a pretty nasty accident. Nathan wished they were still open. That sounded like the perfect job for him. He could just go down into the earth for 12 hours and dig till his heart was content. "Playing in the dirt again, eh, Dryer?" Dryer ignored Lance as he attempted to get under his skin. He was one of those guys that like to pick on people, and the weirder the hobby, the more he picked. He seemed to take the fact that Nathan liked to dig as a personal insult. He probably saw picking on him as a way to get him to stop, but if that had worked, Nathan would have stopped digging in the 4th grade. "Maybe you can dig yourself up some friends," Lance said as Nathan went right on, ignoring him. He heard it when the large man took a step in his direction, but he had already committed to not interacting with him. If there was one thing Nathan hated worse than weird hobbies, it was being ignored. "Hey, freak, I'm talking to you. Clean the dirt out of your ears." Nathan leaned down a little, his finger having brushed something hard and rough. He wanted to know what it was, maybe a cool rock or a beetle, but as Lance got closer, Nathan thought he might not have a chance to get at it. He was saved from further harassment by the yard sergeant calling an end to wreck. Dryer buried his hole again and went to line up with the others, Lance bumping him as he jogged past. Dryer gritted his teeth, wanting to say something nasty back to him, but stopping himself. He had no friends, no gang to help him, and he was practically alone. As Nathan got in line to go back to the dorms, he wished he could dig up some friends, as Lance had suggested. Then maybe he wouldn't be so alone. He had started to walk back in, but he stopped suddenly and looked back at the spot where he'd been digging. Something was calling to him from there, something that really wanted him to go back to digging. As the sergeant yelled at him to hurry up, Nathan started walking again, committing that spot to memory so he could go back there next time. A couple of days later, Nathan was back on the rec yard, digging in the dirt again. He was keeping a wary eye out this time, not wanting to get harassed by Lance again, but he refused to stop what brought him joy. He had a good feeling about this spot, the same spot he'd been digging in the other day, and he wondered if it would be a bug or a rock or maybe a coin or something that someone had lost out here ages ago. There was a gross-looking soap dish in his locker that the officers never bothered to open during searches, and that was where he kept his treasures. There was a long gold fleck in there that he'd found by the pavilion, a dime from 1963, and the remains of a stag beetle that had burrowed down into the clay. They were the closest thing he had to treasures, and he guarded them jealously. "Looks like Dig Dug's at it again," came a familiar voice from behind him. Dryer sighed. Lance had found him earlier than expected. He had started to say something back, but winced as his finger came into contact with something hard, and it nearly ripped his nail off. Dryer looked down to find the top of the stony object again, and as he wiggled it and pried it loose, it finally came free from the dirt. "Hey, freak, I'm talking to you," Lance yelled, clearly not liking being ignored. It was a little stone carving of a screaming face, and despite being horrific, Nathan couldn't look away. It was so strange to find something like this, so unique, so unthought of. "When I talk to you, you respond to me, freak. I'm sick of getting the cold shoulder from someone like..." But Lance had seen the idol now, and it stopped him in his tracks. He had a hand resting on Nathan's shoulder, but the fingers that usually dug into his skin were loose and uncoordinated. Nathan looked and saw that Lance was looking at the idol, and he clearly liked what he saw. The guy had been walking with a skinny trustee named Worthy, and he was asking him what it was as he came over to have a look. Suddenly, two speechless people were standing over him, looking at the carving with reverence. "Wow, Dryer, that's a cool little thing you found there," Lance half whispered. "Yeah," Worthy said. "Think we could have a look?" Nathan was shocked at their change in demeanor, and was eager to bring the carving over to the sitting area under the pavilion. He set it on the table, telling them they could look, but they weren't to touch. The two sat quietly, like children in a museum, and looked at the fabulous carving for quite a while. Dryer was amazed at how quickly they had come under its spell, but to his further amazement, others came to join them. By the time rec was over, Nathan had a group of 8 inmates standing around and looking at the little idol. When he went to line up for his dorm, he was surprised to see that the 8 from the pavilion came to stand beside him. They followed him all the way to the dorm, like ducks behind their mother, and when they got back to the day room, he set the idol down on the table and watched them marvel at it. It attracted others too, catching their eye as they went to watch TV or play cards, and soon the table wasn't big enough to hold them all. That seemed to be when the dorm officer took notice, and Dryer thought the jig might be up when Officer Wellerman came waddling onto the floor. Wailerman to the residents of E-Dorm, was a big-bellied guard who seemed to enjoy lording what little power he had over his charges. He had some weak-chinned TA in there with him tonight, which meant they'd have to suffer him being on the floor more than usual. Wellerman didn't think people who couldn't carry gas had a place on the floor, and as he came towards their little gathering, he had an ear-to-ear grin for them. "Evening, gentlemen. What you got there? Some kind of bug, or maybe some drugs that I need to—" He stopped talking when he saw the idol, and the grin slipped right off his face. He pushed in between a couple of the gawkers and just stared at it as it sat on the table. He was amazed by the little statue, his eyes as wide as a child's on Christmas morning. Whatever power the idol held over him was working overtime if it had managed to net a fat fish like Wellerman. As Nathan watched him, he began to realize that they could use this to their advantage. He just wasn't sure how much power this thing had over the officer yet. "Officer Wellerman?" he asked, leaning down a little. "Do you like my little friend there?" "Yeah," the officer practically whispered. "Wouldn't you like to bring him a little gift? It would make him very happy." Wellerman nodded, his chins wobbling. "First, invite your ward down here to have a look. Then listen very carefully." Wellerman tossed the Hershey bar on a Dryer's bed the next night during master roster count, to the amazement of those in the dorm. He had looked a little shell-shocked when he came to work that day, some distance having taken away some of the idol's power. Not all, apparently, as the candy bar on his bed would attest. He had looked at Dryer strangely when he'd come to work, clearly feeling the pull of the idol, and he wasn't alone. Dryer's life had changed for the better in the last 24 hours. Now he had a small legion of followers that seemed to hang on his every word. They gave him extra food, they let him use the TV, and they hassled people who refused to fall in line. That was becoming a minority in the dorm, to be sure. His little flock from the day before had doubled, and Nathan was living the high life. He was the king of this brood for the most part, and now that Wellerman had proven to be under the idol's sway, he knew he could go further. "You should have asked for something bigger," Lance hissed, sitting back when Wellerman spun and glared at him. He waited till the guard had gone to the other wing before hissing, "Pack of smokes or something." Dryer fixed him with a look, taking the idol out of his front pocket so Lance could see it. "Are you questioning my authority?" Lance looked angry for half a breath, but as the idol came into view, all his anger seemed to melt away. People seemed to listen to him when the idol was out where they could look at it, but once it was out of sight, they seemed to forget that they had decided to follow him. The idol held some power, but Nathan wasn't sure how far he wanted to push that power just yet. He had started with a candy bar, thinking that it might be the easiest way to test it. It wasn't technically against the rules to bring inmates candy, but it would be considered a real bitch move to do so. They likely figured he meant to eat it himself, and as the wrapper came off and Dryer took that first savory bite, he relished the taste of milk chocolate. They got candy here, but it was usually old or slightly melted. It had been 3 years since Nathan had eaten a real, unmelted chocolate bar, and he savored every bite of it. Watching the gathering parishioners, their tongues sliding over greedy lips, Nathan knew he would have to rig up something so that they could see the idol at all times. A necklace, perhaps. As they sat behind the rec yard shed a few days later, smoking Wellerman's latest gift, Dryer felt better than he had in a long time. He was wearing fresh clothes, clean underwear, new socks, and smoking a cigarette for the first time in years. His stomach was full for a change, and he had slept better than he had since going in. He had friends to talk to, instead of just the bugs that squirmed in the yard. He knew they weren't really his friends, not like the few he had had on the outside. They laughed at his jokes, and they shared their food with him, but he couldn't ignore the way that their eyes tracked the swing of the idol as it hung around his neck. He was careful to put it in his shirt when he wasn't around his friends, and so far no one had marked the string or seen the bulge in his shirt. Well, someone had. Someone he was about to regret getting mixed up with. Nathan coughed, suddenly racked with a series of railed gasps. That had been happening more and more lately, and yesterday he had spat a tooth into the sink as well. He wasn't sure why, but he had to think it had something to do with the idol. Maybe it was taking his energy in order to give him the gifts that he was receiving. Well, coughs and a few teeth were a small price to pay for the ability to sway others, and Nathan would give up all his teeth if it meant that he could spend his last year and a half in safety and comfort. The coughing was the reason that he noticed them at all. Nathan saw them as they approached, but he just figured they wanted to bum a smoke. He had used the idol to befriend the guard in the rec building, and he knew that no one would bother them, except for other inmates. There were 4 of them, all of them sporting long sleeves in the early fall heat. He had seen them around lately, keeping their heads together as they conspired, and most people thought they were some kind of new gang that was trying to form. It happened sometimes. Gangs came and went, but the old guard still remained in the end. As they approached, it was clear that they knew who he was, and likely suspected he was trying to form a gang of his own. "Greetings," said the head of the group, an older guy with a greasy ponytail and little gold glasses. "Would you mind if we had a word?" Nathan couldn't think of any reason why not, so he sent a few of his followers away. He kept a few of the bigger guys beside him, though, Lance and Gage and Michaels, just in case this was some kind of shakedown. The men he had brought with him were younger, but they were smaller. Dreyer had little doubt that his 3 could whip all 4 of them if it came to it. "We understand you've found something we're looking for." Nathan furrowed his brow a little. Seemed they were getting right to the point. "You must mean this," he said, taking the idol out of his shirt. The man with the shiny tail of hair practically started drooling when he saw it, and the look was so intense that Nathan wanted to put it away before it got much worse. He'd seen something similar on the face of his newfound friends, but this look had something else in its depths. This was the look of a cancer patient who's seen a cure within easy reach. It's the way the junkie looked at a full hypo, and Dreyer suddenly didn't feel very safe with just 3 guys around. The man looked as if he were contemplating murder, if it would get him that little rock figure. "We'd like to buy it from you. Name your price. We'll pay anything." Nathan did put it away then, seeing their intent. "It's not for sale. It's my most prized possession. I'd sooner sell you my left hand than this." The man smirked. "You wouldn't be the first one to make such a trade in this place." "Well, if you won't sell it, why not a loan? We only really need it for a little while. Then you can have it back. We'll even pay you for the trouble." Dreyer thought about it, but in the end, he just couldn't stand the thought of being parted from it. He had owned it for such a short time, but the little thing meant so much to him that letting anyone else touch it seemed unthinkable. If he gave it to them, he would never see it again. He was as certain of that as he was that old One-Ear would eat his tuna packet if he left it unattended. This guy was part of something weird, maybe worse than a gang, and Nathan suddenly didn't want anything to do with him. "Afraid I'll have to pass, boys. Now head off, you're stinking up the joint." The man glowered at him a little, but then put his hands up in a placating way, and he was all smiles again. "Sorry you feel that way. We'll be going then." He left then, but Dreyer doubted it was the last that he'd see of him. Suddenly, however, the idol rolled on his chest, and the woman looking in at his memories saw an eldritch glow rising in the sunken orbs. The idol held all the fires of hell, all the mysteries of creation, and as it engulfed her, it pushed her out of Nathan Dreyer and back into herself. Winter came shivering up from his mind, the fingers of that faraway power feeling cold and alien as they shoved against her. The warden was beside her then, rattling questions into her ears so fast that she thought she might have whiplash. She pushed him away, trying to catch her breath so she could convey what she had seen. She hadn't seen all of it, but it was enough to show her exactly what they were dealing with. No. You didn't say we were getting involved with shit like this. What? What was it? What did you see? I don't know exactly, but something I've heard of. Capricious God, nothing. Someone is trying to sow real chaos in your prison. Something like this could turn the natural order on its ear. It may have already, the warden said sheepishly. Winter looked at him with horror, waiting for an explanation. The two stood for a moment, Winter staring at her brother, and the warden looking anywhere but at his sister. Something has gained control of the idol, gained control of it about a week ago, and I need to know where it went before they use it to bring something into the prison that I can't stop. You have to get back in there. I need to know where that thing is. Officer Ingram had returned to find Dr. Winters lying on the ground, breathing heavily and trying to get her wits about her. She had felt touched by that strange idol, even through the memories of the man hunched before her, and she just couldn't seem to get her bearings again. What the hell had that been? How had she been reached out to like that through a memory? She didn't know, but she knew that she didn't want to go back in there again. Not much scared Winter, but that thing had. I don't have to do anything, she said, looking up at Officer Ingram as he came back and offered her something cold to drink from the commissary. I told you where it is. My deal is fulfilled as far as I'm concerned. No, the warden said. I need this out of my prison. I need it found and secured before it's too late. Why? Why would you want to possess something like that? Winter suddenly snapped at him. Don't you have enough gewgaws and totems and weird little trump cards at your disposal? How could you possibly think you can control something like this in the first place? This is so beyond you that it isn't even within your kin. Ingram had been hovering, and Winter realized that she hadn't even opened the drink he'd brought for her yet. It was Canada Dry, one of her favorites, and as the crisp bubbles flowed into her dry throat, she smacked her lips appreciatively. She thanked the man, his attitude having warmed to her a little, it seemed, but the warden dismissed him with a chop of his hand and told him not to come back until called. As the door closed, he looked at Winter with all his considerable weight behind that stare. Control it? No, dear sister. I don't want to control it. I want it gone from here. You see, this prison is my personal toy box, but there are many things trapped here that are best left here. I contain them, keep them here for safety, the safety of the community, and something like this could turn them loose on Cashmere and the surrounding area. Crap, Winter shouted, letting her feet wobble. Don't you dare pretend this place is built on altruism. This is a mason jar you keep bugs in, just watching as they kill each other. I've known you since the darkness of the void. Don't pretend your nature has changed in the last 100 years. The warden shrugged. You think so little of me. There's some truth to what you say, but that doesn't mean our goals aren't on the same track. Some of the terrible things I keep here are to torment the souls of those who put themselves in my web. But some of them are here because they would unmake the world that I inhabit. Do you think I want to return to that smoldering pit any more than you do? What memories would you collect in that little book down there? No, sister. If Stragview falls, then your little den of Cashmere falls as well. And I have to say that I don't like your odds. If my prison is a place to hold dangerous animals, then Cashmere is a rehabilitation facility for damaged minds. What would they do if even a few of my little boogans got loose on the town? Could you protect them from the darkness the way that I do? Winter wanted to refute him, but she couldn't. He was right. She was no great warrior. Neither was he, but he had done pretty well so far. Fine. But you have to promise me that you'll destroy this thing once we have it. It's dangerous, brother. Even you know that. If it corrupts one of us, it will never come to that, he assured her. But in order to be rid of it, I have to know where it is. Winter nodded, looking back at the placid old man sitting on the chair before her. He hadn't moved an inch in the time they'd been talking, and he looked like some grotesque doll. He was breathing, that much was true, but Winter wondered how much longer he'd be doing that, too. She had seen him in his memories as a young man, full of life and energy, but this husk that sat before them was all the more reason for them to destroy this idol. If it could do that to a human, she didn't want to imagine what it could do to someone like her or her brother. She took a seat across from Dryer and fixed her hands on either side of his head again. She fell back inside like Alice through the looking glass, and as she landed in the dorm once again, she was glad for the little time skip. Nathan knew he was in trouble, but he didn't know what to do about it. In the last week, he had brought every guard who worked this dorm under his sway, and people were starting to take notice. The bruiser who worked inside security on days, Carmichael, had come in with some of his enforcers and started asking questions. Wellerman answered them as best he could, but Wellerman was starting to slip. A lot of his guys were, and that was worrisome. The longer they stayed under the influence of the totem, and Wellerman was working double shifts sometimes just to be here, the less real they became. They were still there, but their personalities, their uniqueness, began to filter out. Lance mostly just stood around and did what Dryer told him to do, but every now and again he would shake his head and look around like he wasn't quite sure what was going on. It happened a lot in the beginning with Wellerman too, but he hadn't come out in quite a while. Dryer lived in a dorm full of puppets for the most part, and that was starting to weigh on him. Not on his conscience or anything. Dryer didn't really give two figs about these hard cases. But it was a strain to orchestrate a whole dorm's worth of men every day. Dryer was getting up at 3 a.m. every day so he could gather his little flock and tell them what they were doing. Okay, listen up. When I give the signal, we all go to chow, eat our food, put our trays in the wash area, and line up outside the chow hall. Then we go back to our dorm when I give the signal again. Every part had to be given exactly, too. A couple of days ago, we had forgotten to tell them to put their trays in the slot, and they had all gotten into some trouble when they tried to take them back to the dorm. Dryer had managed to put the hoodoo on Sergeant Wise, the guy watching the chow hall that day, but it had been a near thing. After that, Dryer had started writing things down so he didn't forget them, and was sure to give orders precisely. Go to the rec yard when it's time. You 20 play baseball, you 12 walk the track, you 8 play basketball. The rest of you go sit around and talk and pretend to be socializing. When they call over the loudspeaker, go to your bunks and go to sleep. Day in and day out. That was what his life had become. He should count himself lucky, he thought sometimes. They didn't live in a work squad dorm. Then he'd have to tell 70 men how to do their job every day. Speaking of, he had to start making Wellerman go home. At first, it had been a treat to have the sergeant here for days on end. Wellerman brought them things, told them things, helped them get extra yard time and extra trips to the canteen. But he was getting to be as absent as the rest. Sergeant Carmichael had actually started coming in because of Wellerman. When the sergeant wouldn't answer his radio, he had come to check on him in his TA. He had started to send him home, but Wellerman had insisted that he was fine to stay, and Carmichael had relented. That was good, because whatever power the totem had, Carmichael was immune to it. Dryer had tried to sway him in the beginning, thinking Carmichael would be the ultimate ally, but the burly yard sergeant had scoffed and asked him what in the hell he thought he had there. You better make that disappear before I do, Dryer. Next time I come looking for contraband, I better not find you with that either. I got too much going on today to fill out paperwork for taking a necklace. But I'll have all the time in the world if I decide to make it my business." After that, Dryer had kept it put away. He coughed, and when he looked down, he saw blood again. That was getting worrisome. He didn't dare go to medical with it, but his teeth and hair had been falling out more frequently. His head was hurting too. A lot. There were times when he thought he might be hallucinating voices. The voices never told him anything nice. They never really told him anything at all. The voices sounded more like earthquakes, rumbles from deep in the earth, and the words he did get from them were terrible. He was coughing more too, coughing up red stuff, and he was beginning to really think that it was the totem. He wanted to give it up, he wanted to throw it away, but he didn't dare. He had tried a few weeks ago, and the results had been disastrous. On top of the headaches and the loss of sanity, Dryer had started hearing things in those rumbles. First it was just a few words, but now he could understand the rumbling, roaring voices better than he could his own. They wanted him to do things that didn't make a lot of sense, and Nathan wasn't sure how much longer he could take it. So one night, as his minions just stood around and looked at the walls, he slipped the totem off and put it in his locker. He thought that being out of contact with it would stop some of the problems, and as the rumbling voice stopped and the ice pick behind his eyes ebbed, Dryer felt like he might be at peace for the first time in a few weeks. No more voices, no more pain, but as he closed his eyes to enjoy the silence, he was in for a whole new set of problems. The screaming started about a minute after he shut his eyes. It was sudden and absolute. Everyone went from staring and existing to screaming and grabbing their heads. Fights broke out. People began running around, and as Nathan watched from his bunk, all he could think to do was reach for the necklace. As he held it up, all eyes were on him again, and order was suddenly restored. He could hear Wellerman's radio asking just what the hell was going on in his dorm, and he told the officer to give them the all clear and say it was just a momentary misunderstanding. He told everyone to go to bed after that, but as he lay there listening to the rumbles, Dryer wasn't sure how much longer he could take this. "We heard the ruckus the other night. You sure you won't reconsider our offer?" Dryer looked up, as confused by the intrusion as his charges seemed to be all the time. They were on the rec yard again, milling and going about the motions, and as the group approached them, Dryer looked down and coughed. His hand was red again, and the blood was becoming more frequent. "That looks bad," the man with the ponytail said, "but I think you'd get better if you just gave us the totem. Without it around, you wouldn't have to worry anymore." Dryer was quiet for a moment, contemplating as he tried to make his brain cells work, and he knew the man was wondering if he would respond at all. "Why would I do that?" he finally husked out. What good is it to you?" "It isn't me who wants it," the man said, and when he lifted his sleeve, Dryer saw something carved into the skin of his arm. It was red and running, but the words "Jessie" were still very clear. "She tells us what she wants with this power. The power to bring this prison down, and we obey. We are followers of her wisdom and love, and we will see her will done." Dryer realized then that they were no different than him. They were being moved by something much larger than they were, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "Go away," he said, and the men around him must have heard something in it, because they started moving between Dryer and the Ponytail Man. "You won't last much longer," Ponytail said. "We'll have it, one way or another." He left again, and Dryer was forced to come to terms with the fact that the man might be right. "You look like shit, Dryer. Why don't you just tell us what this is all about?" Dryer had to admit that Carmichael was right. He did look like shit. He had 2 teeth left, a small collection of hair that would make Homer Simpson envious, but not many others, and he had shrunk an inch already. He was sitting in his boxer shorts after the 3rd dorm search they'd had that week, and Dryer was honestly tired of all this. When the goon squad came in, the whole dorm had got up as one and just walked to the day room. Dryer had been with them as he strolled listlessly at the back of the line. Carmichael had taken note of him as he passed, and as Dryer watched all their crap being piled beside their beds, he had expected this confrontation and been prepared for what he had to do. "Sure, Sarge. Why don't you take me out of the dorm so we can talk privately?" Carmichael thought about this for a moment, finally nodding as he stepped to the side and let Dryer make his way out. The two had no sooner stepped out of the dorm when the screaming started again. It didn't make Carmichael as worried as Dryer thought it should. "If I tell you, I need protection. I need to be out of this dorm and away from anyone associated with it." His voice sounded husky, like someone getting over pneumonia, but he pressed on as his mind tried to put the pieces together. "I think that can be arranged, as long as what you have to tell me is enough to warrant it." So, Dryer had spilled the whole sad story for him. He told him how he had found the idol on the rec yard. He told him how he had used it to control people. He told him how it had all been great at first, but now, between the headaches and the lack of sleep, and his body slowly dying, he was ready for it to be over. He just wanted peaceful sleep. He just wanted the rumbles to stop. And he just wanted to not be the puppet master over 70 blank slates for a while. Inside the dorm, he could hear the other members of the goon squad yelling and trying to gain order again. And he doubted he would be alone in medical if that was where he was going. Carmichael reached out a hand. "Give it to me. Give me this thing, and I promise you that I'll put you somewhere quiet where you will never be bothered again." Dryer almost wept as he slid it off his neck, handing it to Carmichael with trembling fingers. As he did, however, he noticed something high up on the man's arm. It was fresh ink, maybe a year or 2 old, but he could clearly see familiar words near the start of the man's massive bicep. The ESSE made him think that there was likely a J past the rim of his uniform sleeve, and it took all his limited control to keep his face from giving him away. If Carmichael believed that he had guessed who the sergeant was actually working for, the quiet place he would go to would likely be a hole near the fence line. Someone came out then, yelling for Carmichael to come and help. The sergeant told the officer to take this inmate to medical and get him rehoused in an ISO cell for possible TB. He said he wanted this whole dorm quarantined, and no one was to go in or come out for at least a week. Others were running up now, and as the officer took Dryer away, he saw Carmichael look at the idol and grin. He knew what he had, and he already knew what he was going to do with it. Winter came up like a diver again, shaking all over as she looked at her brother. It's a sergeant, Carmichael, and he has the idol already." The warden nodded, lifting his radio to call someone. Winter put a hand on his arm and shook her head. "There's something else at play. Some other entity that's taking control of it." The warden cocked his head. "Do tell." "There were other inmates interested in it. They had marks that were similar to the markings Carmichael had. I think it was a name. A woman's name. Jessie," the warden hissed out. "God damn it. What is that bitch up to now?" Do you know her?" Winter asked, straightening her blouse as she followed him out of the room. "Unfortunately, Jessie is someone I haven't thought about in a long time, but she's someone I've been forced to remember very recently. If she's after the idol, then there's no telling what she means to do with it. Whatever it is, it's not good for Stragview, or for Cashmere. He picked up the radio then, asking for a location on Sergeant Carmichael. Dispatch was quiet for a moment, before coming back with an answer that quickened the warden's steps. "He's doing a fence check, sir. His last call-in was near..." A pause. G-dorm. No, wait. J-dorm. "He's checking the..." But the warden swore loudly and dropped the radio as he began to run. "What's wrong?" Winter asked, not sure what was happening. "That bitch! That bitch!" he screamed, pushing through the doors and almost bowling over Officer Ingram. "She's playing with things she doesn't understand." "Sir?" Ingram asked, falling in beside him. "Get some men together and come to J-dorm," he shouted. "If you encounter Sergeant Carmichael, I want him taken to the tower. Immediately." "What's going on?" Ingram said. "Is he trying to break someone out or something?" The warden laughed, but there was no joy in it. "Yes, as a matter of fact, he is. And if he manages it, we are all royally fucked." The warden looked at J-dorm, the haunted-looking edifice that was the death house, and sighed as if he would rather be anywhere else. Winter understood. She could think of very few places she wanted to be less than this place. He had made calls after securing the gate, giving orders that no one was to go in or out, and in 30 minutes he had 12 lean, mean fellas arrayed by the fence, with little badges that identified them as CERT team members, whatever that meant. They had empty holsters today. No weapons were allowed on the compound, outside of an emergency situation. They had the little black cans that all the officers carried, and some of them had tasers as well. It seemed a lot of effort for one man, but if he actually had what she'd seen, then she supposed they might need them. He turned away from the death house as one of the men came closer and whispered something to him, addressing the men as they stood respectfully. Even these guys, certified head knockers, knew better than to get on the wrong side of the warden of Stragview, it seemed. "Gentlemen, I'm going to say this once, so listen up. A few of you have worked here before, and you know the reputation of J-dorm. But for those who don't, we're going into the eye of hell." A few of them snorted, but the 3 or 4 of them who had worked here looked scared enough to crap masonry. They knew this place, and they knew its reputation. This place hasn't been opened since the last execution at Stragview. No one has set foot in this dorm since Alex Murphy died, and it's a strange place. We're going in to get Andrew Carmichael out, and when we have him, we're going to get out as quickly as we can. Someone towards the end of the line whistled a few bars of Ghostbusters, and some of the CERT guys laughed a little under their breath. The warden rounded on him, shutting them up in short order. "You think this is a joke? I lost 5 men in this building a year ago. Do not go in there thinking this is a joke. This building and the things inside will eat you alive. Stay together. Don't go off by yourself, and we'll make it out alive. Lieutenant Rogers, arrange your men, and let's get this underway." They all had flashlights, the little tactical ones that you could stick on your belt when you weren't using them, and the warden handed Winter one of the big mag lights that you so often saw on security guards in movies. It looked thick enough to bash someone's brains in with, though Winter hoped she wouldn't have to use it for that. They all proceeded in, Winter and the warden taking up the back. Lieutenant Rogers went in first, and when he reached around to flip the switch, there was nothing but a dry click and a pop as several of the lights died. The others flickered for a moment, and then went dead. They were left with nothing but flashlights, and Rogers told the warden and Dr. Winters to stay here while they checked the housing area. The warden warned them again to be cautious, and they promised that they would. "So," Winter asked, "what's the deal with this place? It's not like you to be so worried about anything." The warden swung his flashlight around, looking in the corners for something, and not finding it. We did something we shouldn't have done, and now I've invited them in. We let a Trojan horse into the prison, and if it's in league with Jessie, then we might be in a lot of trouble. Who's this Jessie? Why are you so afraid of her?" He bit his lip, another first, and seemed to contemplate how best to answer her. "About 30 years ago, I did something unadvisable. He paused, looking sheepish. "I took a lover." Winter snorted. "Oh no, God forbid. It's not something I do often. Humans are not something I like to mingle with, but this one seemed different. She seemed more like us than her own kind, and for a time, we were content. Then she began to want more. Our father's always telling us how we need to spread our wild oats among the sheep, but when she came up pregnant, suddenly there was all of this talk about marriage and child support. It didn't help that she was utterly immune to my charms. Some of them are, you know, and refused to be swayed. I was finally forced to tell her that we had no future together, and she did not take it well." Winter nodded. "I should think not. Did she get the courts involved? I think I would have heard if you had a paternity suit in the works." The warden shook his head. "No. She responded by flinging herself from the tower you passed on the way here." Winter put a hand over her mouth. "God! Over you?" The warden shrugged. "I suppose. This was back when the tower was infested with rats, too. She went in at night, and they found her on the ground inside the tower fence when the sun came up. Ever since, there have been whispers about a ghost named Jessie. She haunts the grounds. She haunts the dorms. She sows chaos from time to time, but only recently has she become a real problem. I'm a little afraid that my unborn child might have granted her some kind of otherworldly powers in the hereafter, but who's to say? There's a lot of vengeful spirits in this place, but she's the only one I have no real control over." Winter pursed her lips, digesting what he had said. "You have control over ghosts?" she asked suddenly. Ghosts were usually a little beyond them, being something different than their usual realm of expertise. "Well, it's the same way I control some of the other things that take up residence here. It's more like I give them fences and let them hunt. It's within my power to destroy them, but it benefits me to have them here. They're like zoo animals. As long as my guests don't wander into their enclosure, they don't get eaten up." Winter was horrified, but she found herself nodding as well. It made a species of sense. "So why haven't you destroyed Jessie if she's such a problem?" "Oh, I tried. More than once. She's resilient. Every time I banish her, she comes back. She's tied to this place in an unhealthy way, and I can't seem to be rid of her." So then, but the radio crackled, and Lieutenant Rogers reported that they had found nothing in the East housing area. "We're coming back to check the offices in the West housing area before we go on to the killing floor." "Copy, Lieutenant. Keep your eyes peeled for movement." Winter gave him a minute before starting again. "So then what's so special about Alex Murphy? Wasn't he that serial killer who picked up hitchhikers?" "Yes, but it was what he befriended at the mental hospital that made him so dangerous. He befriended something from outside our understanding." Winter scoffed. "What's outside our understanding?" The CERT team came back up the hall, flashlights out, and staying in tight formation as they proceeded north into the office area. Winter quieted until they were out of earshot, and when she looked back at her brother, he seemed to be having difficulty getting it out. "Do you remember anything Father said about the creatures from outside our reality?" Winter nodded, ticking them off on her fingers as she recalled them. The pale lady, the green man, the bright, those shadow things. The gallery, the warden corrected. That's what he brought in with him. Winter was shocked. I didn't actually believe any of them were real. I just thought they were Father's paranoia working overtime. Do you mean to tell me that this gallery is real? Oh, they're real, all right. I've been keeping them pinned up here since they escaped during the execution. The bastard let them loose with his dying breath, and they've been trying to get into the prison ever since. These things would play merry hell inside the grounds, worse than Jesse ever could, and I like the idea of them teaming up about as much as I like the idea of Father knowing I wasn't able to contain them. Winter started to poke fun at him, but she understood. Her brother had always been the favorite, the golden child, and he didn't want Father to be disappointed in him. She wished that she could make him believe that Father's approval wasn't the most important thing there was, but she knew he wouldn't listen. He had always craved their father's attention, and he would have been the hardest of their siblings to convince that his love was not something they could obtain. She supposed they were all likely on Earth somewhere. That was the nature of their kind. But Winter had no real desire to see any of them. She was the oldest of her father's daughters, the first to leave, and she had never been very close with any of them. She would have gone right on avoiding them if her brother hadn't gone and spoiled it. Office is clear. We're proceeding to the west housing area and the killing floor. Winter jumped a little, having forgotten about the radio, and as the warden keyed it up and acknowledged, he sighed deeply. I was really hoping he would be in one of the cells, maybe in the office somewhere, trying to fight the urge to go to her. But I suppose I know where we would find him. We need to go with them as they proceed. I have a feeling he's made his way to the killing floor already. Winter nodded, and as the CERT team came back around, the two not-quite-humans fell in behind them. They moved with precision, though Winter doubted that this was what they had been trained for. She wondered if any of them would have to die today. She hoped not. She was tired of watching people die for things they didn't really understand. Things like the byplay of gods and the often difficult-to-understand conflict between beings outside their understanding. Most of these men likely wanted nothing more complex than to go home, eat dinner, and fall asleep in their own beds with someone they loved. Pamela wanted the same thing, though Winter doubted it would be something that could be achieved, not without some kind of conflict. The cells in the western housing area yawned open like hungry mouths as they passed up the hall. These were more like the cells people saw in movies, the deep cells that stretched into the concrete with a bed and a toilet and a metal door with a single window that looked out. The inmates would have all that room to themselves, too, and Winter bet that many of the inmates in the facility would have killed for accommodations like this. Most of those who got to live in them had done just that, she reminded herself, and as they cleared each of the cells, they proceeded to the killing floor. She hadn't felt it before now, but as she walked up that hallway, Winter felt a strange sense of being watched. The shadows around the top of the doorway looked too thick. The darkness that permeated the corners of those cells was too substantial, and Winter could feel something pressing at her. It was different from the totem that she had seen in her vision, the difference between grabbing something cold and touching a hot stove, but it still made her wince whenever that regard settled on her. Was this what her brother had feared? Was this what had terrified the warden of Stragview? She didn't know, but she suspected that it was. She felt something different as she came into the room that served as the killing floor, and that prickling felt more natural. This was the feeling of hairs rising on the back of your neck. This was how she knew something otherworldly was in there, and when the CERT team began to hesitate, Winter figured that they had found what they were looking for. "Warden, there's someone in there." The warden pushed his way through the group, Winter following in his wake. She had a front row seat for the large man in the gray uniform as he tried his best to get into what had been the little room where they put the needles in their charges. The windows in the little room were completely black, a deep midnight existing behind them, and the longer she looked, the more Winter thought it might be moving. The man by the door, that hulking bruiser with his sleeves pushed up to reveal his tattoos, was sweating and grunting as he tried to push his hand closer to the door. The idol was glowing, pulsating with a soupy light, but whatever barrier her brother had raised seemed to be holding him at bay. I can't reach it, he growled through clenched teeth, and as Winter watched, she saw a translucent figure appear behind him. The figure put her hand over his, the small and delicate fingers looking comical beside his bunched and hairy knuckles, and as she gave him her power, the hand moved a little closer to the door. This, it seemed, was the mysterious Jessie. Pamela had to admit that her brother had taste. The woman was waifish in a way that made Winter think death had not shrunk her, and her long silver hair flowed down around her like a river. She was dressed in a long blue garment that looked like it had started life as a sheet, and when she noticed them, the specter hissed at the warden as if to tell him to stay away. Lieutenant Rogers made to enter, but the warden put a hand out. Take your men up the hall. As soon as I deal with her, I'll call you, and you can come escort Sergeant Carmichael away. Sir, are you sure that's... I don't have time to argue with you. Do as I say, Lieutenant. Rogers nodded, though he seemed unsure as to why. He told his men to back up and pulled the door closed as the warden and Dr. Winters stepped onto the killing floor. Carmichael looked worried for half a heartbeat, but when she touched his face and turned him back to the door, he looked totally at peace again. Jessie, it seemed, knew how to get men to do what she wanted, and death hadn't stopped her from getting her way. Why did you bring them if you were just going to send them out? Winter hissed as they approached. Witnesses, her brother breathed. Carmichael is a normal person, and he needs normal people to bring him to justice. The meaning wasn't hard for Winter to figure out. Jessica, the warden began. No, you don't get to use that name. Call me what you used to call me when we were together. You created me, after all, so why not use the name you gave me before you killed me? Winter expected him to try to deny it, but he just shrugged. Jessie, then, whatever this is, it's over now. You know you can't stand against me. You know I'll scatter you again, and you'll be nothing but vapor until you can form again. Jessie gritted her teeth in a painful rictus. That's true, but I know something you can't stand against. You're so afraid of them that you locked them away, or so you thought. The warden snorted, shaking his head as he walked towards the sergeant and took hold of his wrist. It broke, loud enough to echo across the small room, and he caught the totem as it fell towards the ground. And you would have gotten away with it, too, if you'd only started a little earlier. Sergeant Carmichael took a swing at him with his free hand, but the warden caught it and tossed him easily aside. He went sprawling in a heap on the concrete, breathing in little gasps as he held his wrist. He looked confused, and when Winter bent beside him and put a hand on his temple, he flinched away. Don't, he breathed, don't you... But as her hand slid into his temple, Winter was already riffling through his memories of what had happened. Jessie had gotten her hooks into him about a year ago, while she was drawing life force from some of the inmates in the prison, and it had been all too easy to bring him under her sway. He had helped her recruit more, helped her grasp the tattered ends of her former followers, and now Jessie had a cult even larger than before. As Carmichael fell, Winter heard someone cry out pitifully. She turned to find the warden pressing the ghost girl against the side of the death house, the specter twisting and writhing as he looked at Winter. I need one more thing before our business is completed. Take her memories and leave her to drift. Winter was frozen for a moment, unsure she could even do such a thing. Brother, spirit memories are different than human memories. Ghosts are made of memories, and I'm not even sure I can stop talking about it and come do it. This little bitch has been a thorn in my side for too long, and I'm tired of dealing with this spiteful jade. Winter thought about it. She really did. But as she watched the two together, she began to realize that her brother wasn't the only victim here. She said you killed her, Pamela said, staring daggers at her brother as the spirit tried to rake him with phantom fingers. What did she mean? The warden rolled his eyes. She would say anything to justify what she's done. She's a spiteful harpy trying to... Did you kill her? The warden sighed theatrically, and the sound came out more exasperated than disgusted. I've killed lots of people, sweet sister. You've killed lots of people. We kill people sometimes. They learn what we are. They threaten to tell people. They threaten to go to people who could send us back from whence we came. So we end them. She was only going to live for a few decades. What's her life, her child's life, next to mine? Pamela had heard enough. She turned, heading for the door. Sister, I'll bill you. You have your rock, you have your traitor. Deal with the loose ends yourself. It's what you're best at, after all. If you leave... But she turned and raked him with a stare. I have completed our bargain. Now take out your own trash. Whatever check you send me better not bounce either. Otherwise I'll come back, and my collection process will make your little girlfriend's power play look like a bag of flaming shit on your doorstep. She left then. Left her brother holding his ex-lover. Left the rotten stench of Stragview behind. She had already decided to burn this pantsuit and get a new one. She'd never be able to wash the taint of this place off her. Not with 1,000 washings. He'd be back. He always came back. But she hoped it would be another century before she saw him or any of her other siblings again. Maybe she should go get some therapy, she thought with a little chuckle as she walked past the stunned members of the CERT team. Perhaps it was time to get her own closure and put the dysfunction of her own family behind her. Maybe she'd even use the money from her brother's check to pay for it. Wouldn't that just be so poetic?